You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to Horror Babble. Today, we're thrilled to present a biggie featuring the renowned paranormal investigator, Peter Van Melsen. There are some interesting developments in store for our PI this time round, in a tale concerning the otherworldly journey of a young man by the name of Jason Murphy. We highly recommend that you listen to the previous Van Melsen stories before jumping into this one, as this story completes the first phase of tales concerning the character. See the video description below for a link to the Van Melsen playlist. The lore of the Dreamscape picks up where the Stonegate Horror left off, with Van Melsen up in Scotland, summoned by an old friend. This recording is dedicated to our Cthulhu and Yellow Level Horror Babblers on Patreon. Thanks as always for your continued support, folks. And without further ado, The Lore of the Dreamscape by Ian Gordon. It's a dusty old thing, that memory, littered with weeds unseen, over the hills under the trees there on the edge of a dream. Stray too far and you'll miss it. The thought it won't ever occur, to stray into wilds without reason, magnificent the end of despair. Beyond the bridges of slumber, no couth and her barnacled throne, fade into blackness and stroll by the light, close to the end of the line. And when awake once again by the starlight, look to the eye of the storm, but beware the path less travelled, for you might just forget who you are. The Path. Prologue. The renowned paranormal investigator Peter Van Melsen was in good company. He was sitting opposite his old friend Gary Cook, at Cook's Books in Scotland's national book town, Wigtown. The PI had recently been tasked by Cook with the retrieval of an extraordinary artifact. In quest of the elusive item, Van Melsen had plunged into the tunnels beneath the old city of York, aided by another chum, the young student, Alan Moore. The recovery hadn't been without its dangers, though. He and Ellen managed to outmaneuver an ancient entity known as a Sentinel, the designated guardian of the artifact in question. Following the escapade, it had been Van Melsen's hope that his old friend Gary would collect the little black box from his home in Rosedale, North Yorkshire. No such luck. Somehow, Cook had convinced Van Melsen to make the 200-mile journey to his humble bookshop in Dumfries and Galloway in order to assist him with an even bigger problem, an issue the investigator was unable to ignore due to his inexplicable connection to it. According to Cook, the little black box, an item of some power, if Van Melsen's inability to handle it without succumbing to fantasies was anything to go by, hadn't belonged to those who revered it in the shadowy catacombs of York. Then how did it come to be there? Van Melsen asked, more than a little surprised. Cook, a rotund gent in his late 70s, was perched on a barrel stool, smoking. It's a long story, Peter. Van Melsen, too, was smoking, inhaling deeply. You know me, Gary. I'm rather partial to a long story. It was a warm July evening. Surrounded by books on all sides, the pair were perspiring. Can you give me something to work with, Gary? The investigator blurted. I feel like a slow-roasted chicken here. Cook leaned forward and nodded. I'll give it to you straight, Peter. We're off on a little trip this evening. Van Melsen, exhausted after spending most of the day climbing on and off trains, replied, A little trip? Well, you've made it this far, haven't you? Cook said. The investigator frowned. The bigger problem, Cook had mentioned over the phone just 24 hours earlier, had concerned the mysterious and missing figure Jason Murphy. Having spent most of the year haunted by Murphy in one way or another, Van Melsen had agreed to assist Cook, if only to be freed of the young man's persistent presence. Just 6 months before, whilst investigating a curious entity in the forest of Galloway, Van Melsen had come across a reference to the missing man etched in the door of a derelict farmhouse deep in the woods. Thereafter, a recurring dream of the investigators had increased in frequency, a nightmare he had endured for as long as he could remember, in which he would find himself leaping from a cliff in a huge underground cavern, startled into doing so by an approaching shape to his rear. And more recently, having gripped the little black box in that dreadful subterranean sanctum, Van Melsen had been subjected to an unnerving phantasmagoria. From another's perspective, he'd watched himself leap from the cliff in the cavern, his gaunt frame tumbling towards a slow-moving airship below. Had he been watching through Jason Murphy's eyes? He felt all but sure that he had, for during his brief, gloved contact with the mysterious box, he'd heard a faraway voice whisper the man's name. "What do you actually know about Murphy?" Cook asked. "Bits and pieces," the PI returned. "Disappeared over a decade ago. Walked the path, as it was later termed. 4 Steps Murphy, they call him, the steps relating in some way to his supposed crossing of the bridges of slumber. Murphy's method, some refer to it. The custodians come up, too. You know, as first mentioned in Dylan Fisk's Nun." "Daniel Fisk," Cook corrected. "Daniel, yes," Van Melsen accepted, before continuing. "Our old pal Norman asserts that the custodians know where to find Murphy. Says his method produced an active element, like the old portals in the forest up here." Cook puffed on his cigarette, nodding. "Heard this from Kane, you say?" "Educated conjecture, as he put it," Van Melsen replied. "Well, there's some truth to it," Cook said, climbing to his feet. Hobbling over to a dusty bureau, he plucked a frayed book from one of its many drawers and handed it to the PI. Van Melsen opened the book and saw that it was a handwritten journal. "Everything I know about Murphy is on those pages," Cook said, returning to his stool. After a few minutes spent leafing through the journal, the investigator looked up at his old friend, a look of wonder on his bony face. "The box produced the active element?" "That's what the evidence suggests," Cook replied, motioning towards the brown travel bag sitting on the small coffee table separating the two. "That's why I had you retrieve it, Peter." "Wait a minute," the investigator said, dumbfounded. Then, pointing at his travel bag, "That thing in my bag there is the box?" "Yes. The custodian recovered it from precisely the spot in which Murphy happened upon the active element. He and the box traded places, as it were. Something called to him, lured him there." Once again, Van Melsen frowned, asking, "To what end?" "That's the million-dollar question, old friend." The investigator shook his head. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Staying on the subject of the box for the moment," Van Melsen pressed, "how on earth did it end up in the hands of those cultists in York?" Cook frowned. "Like I said, Peter, it's a long story." A look of apprehension appeared on the investigator's face. "The gloves you provided," Van Melsen said, shaking his head. "They shielded me from the truth, didn't they? If I'd known it was the box you'd sent me after." "Believe me," the shopkeeper returned. "The last thing you needed down there was a realization of that magnitude." Van Melsen puffed on the remnants of his cigarette, lit another with it. "So let me guess. You're sending me after him." Cook nodded, his wrinkly cheeks suddenly rosy. "We have to know what happened to him, Peter. What it was that summoned him, and why." The PI sighed. "I'll do it, Gary, but You have to level with me first." The shopkeeper nodded again, returning, "Absolutely." "You're a custodian, aren't you?" Cook lit another cigarette before answering. With lungs filled with smoke, he uttered, "I am, though I prefer the term bookman." "Bookman?" "Yes, has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Van Melsen gazed at his old friend, his eyebrows raised questioningly. "You needn't be concerned, Peter. I'm just a scholar. I rarely leave Wigtown." "I have to admit," the investigator stated, "I had my suspicions when we last spoke on the subject." The shopkeeper shrugged, adding, "No more secrets. You have my word." "I won't deny you secrets, Gary. We all have them," the PI affirmed diplomatically. "Just tell me, where do we go from here?" "Follow me, and bring that bag with you," Cook instructed, then climbed to his feet, wandering off in the direction of the basement. The basement of Cook's Books was a brightly lit space, filled to the brim with cardboard boxes, many of which were stamped with the name of the shopkeeper's bi-monthly publication, Mysteries of the Mind. Guiding Van Melsen through the maze of packaging, Cook led him to an open area towards the back of the cellar, that to the investigator's eyes resembled a hookah lounge, all Afghan rugs and Killam cushions. From a garish chandelier above flowed a haze of diffuse light, softening somewhat the dazzling reds and fiery oranges of the gaudy furnishings. "What is this place?" Van Melsen quizzed, grimacing. "I'm thinking of calling it the Gateway," Cook returned, grinning. "I see," the investigator said, trawling through the front pocket of his velvet blazer for a cigarette. "Take a seat, Peter," Cook invited, indicating the many cushions covering the floor. Van Melsen did so, lighting the cigarette he'd fished out in the process. Cook took a seat opposite him. "Now then," the shopkeeper said, "let me tell you everything I know." The chap with the white hair and indigo eyes was ready to delineate his plan of action, a scheme that had been in the works for many years, but a bit of background was required to kick things off. Jason Murphy, a resident of West Broughton, Lancashire, disappeared in the latter days of November 2004. A neighbour who lived across from Murphy in the apartment block on James Street found the young man's door wide open one morning, and, suspecting something untoward had befallen him, called the police. A thorough search of Murphy's flat revealed nothing to suggest foul play. In fact, it appeared as though the loner had simply climbed to his feet one night and abandoned the place. Unwashed dishes filled the sink, a half-eaten meal was still out on the kitchen table, and a muted television was flashing away in the living room. The local papers reported the disappearance, and thus an enthralling mystery was born. "The first I heard of it," Van Melsen put in, "was Bob Wright's article in Fortean Weekly, early '06 it would have been. If I recall correctly, wasn't it a local dog walker that said he'd seen a chap matching Murphy's description, walking in the fields just north of town?" "That's right," said Cook. All and sundry started searching for Murphy after that. Somehow Bob Wright caught wind of the investigation and, evidently intrigued by the odd circumstances surrounding the young man's disappearance, drove up to Lancashire to join the search. "Classic Bob Wright," Van Melsen said, puffing on his cigarette. The shopkeeper went on to say that Wright, a.k.a. Bob's Always, after spending several days in West Broughton combing the surrounding fields and talking to Murphy's neighbours, deduced that there wasn't anything particularly remarkable about the young man. He was a loner, it came out, an unemployed 30-something, who, aside from a perfunctory interest in the occult, spent most of his time at home, whiling away the hours in front of the television. And yet, despite this suggestion of mundanity, Bob's always felt quite strongly that Murphy had strolled out that night with a specific purpose in mind, though what that purpose was, the writer could only surmise. Cook paused to light another cigarette. This is where the bookmen come in, Peter. Wright's article in Fortean Weekly caught the attention of a Manchester-based custodian, a bookman called Pimpernella. Can't say I've heard that name before, Van Melsen declared. I'm not surprised, Cook said. She kept a low profile. Past tense, Gary? Bear with me, old friend. The shopkeeper went on to relate the circumstances surrounding Pimpernella's discovery of the little black box. It's like this. If there's an active element within a certain radius, we can detect it, Cook stated. On the back of Wright's article, Pimpernella went out to West Broughton. Using a piece of equipment we call a primary, she managed to locate the AE. Quite the journey she went on, I can tell you. Ended up in the West Pennines. Van Melsen nodded, saying, White Coppice, wasn't it? Aye. Not completely out of the loop, are you, Peter? Like I said earlier, bits and pieces. Well, Cook continued, Pimpernella located the little black box by the aptly named Black Brook, just on the outskirts of the Lancashire hamlet. Initially, she theorized that the missing 31-year-old had employed a rather uncommon psychic ability in order to produce the now-defunct active element. Telekinetic compulsion, by any chance? Van Melsen ventured. Aye, said Cook. The PI said, Well, as I'm sure we've discussed before, Gary, telekinetic compulsion requires foreknowledge of that which is sought. One focuses on a given location or object and is drawn towards it. The same method I utilized in order to find the sanctum in the York catacombs. Absolutely, Gary said, nodding. You'd have saved Pimpernella a great deal of time if you'd been around back then, Peter. Took her months to rule TC out. And that's why it has to be you that goes after the young man. You're the only one qualified for the job. Van Melsen frowned, suddenly aware once again of the peculiar den in which he was sitting. I have to admit, Gary, I want Murphy out of my mind. Indeed. Doesn't it seem as though he's reaching out to you? The shopkeeper proposed. It's possible, Van Melsen agreed. But why me? It's not as though I know the man. Beyond speculation at this point, Peter. Van Melsen puffed on his cigarette, right down to the butt it was. What happened to the custodian, Pimpernella? He asked. Well, Cook began, sighing. We've Pimpernella to thank for retrieving the gubbins from Murphy's flat, his vague notes concerning the 4 steps, the verse we now know as the path. Without her, that lot would have gone to the tip. Fascinating, the investigator reflected. I've always wondered how that stuff came to light. The shopkeeper hesitated, shaking his head. But she wasn't the same after recovering the box, he continued. It changed her. She was hell-bent on going after the young man, wouldn't listen to reason, clung to the little thing day and night. It warped her. She grew impatient, communed with the old ones, they say, handed herself over to those cultists, descended into the tunnels under York, just like you, Peter. Took us years to piece the whole grimy affair together. Blimey, Gary, the investigator said, reluctantly revisiting those shadowy passageways. I daren't imagine what became of her. Better not to try, old friend. But know this, she hasn't been heard from since. A moment of shadowy silence passed between the two, as both Cook and Van Melsen visibly reeled from the brown travel bag in their midst. With his mind on the strange item sitting quietly nearby, the investigator said, I've heard the stories, Gary, all the rumours, but I'd like to hear your take on it. Where do you think Murphy ended up? Oh, it's very hard to say, Peter, Cook admitted, though the most compelling rumour in the air, as far as I'm concerned, is the notion that he did indeed happen upon and cross the bridges of slumber, those links between worlds, and found himself elsewhere. It's been suggested that Murphy was a very sensitive dreamer. Perhaps he was shown a glimpse of something beyond his reckoning, The promise of an irresistible utopia, the path to it ensured by the manifestation of that little black box. But what of the steps? Van Melsen queried. This is 4 Steps Murphy we're talking about. There are many possibilities, Peter, Cook said, his bushy eyebrows raised. A means by which to locate the bridges of slumber? A series of instructions pertaining to his return, perhaps? A way back? The investigator mused. Indeed. Pimpernella said as much following the discovery of Murphy's notes. Van Melsen sighed, saying, A missing dreamer, a series of vague instructions, an unfathomable black box. Oh, I'm at a loss, Gary. Such is the nature of the thing, old friend. However, my plan to go after the young man isn't quite as verbose. Then why don't we just get to it? Van Melsen blurted, lighting another cigarette irritably. The old shopkeeper nodded and took a deep breath. Okay, Peter, Cook said. We've got the box, and that's all we need in terms of navigation. Pass me the bag. Warily, Van Melsen handed the travel bag to Cook, noting the shape of the lamp within as he did so. The shopkeeper donned a pair of gloves, thick leather gloves, just like those he'd provided the PI with for use in the York catacombs. Then, with great care, removed the little black box from the bag. For a moment, Cook just held it there in the palm of his hands, marvelling at its stark simplicity, the lack of embellishment, an ebon cube some 4 inches square. Van Melsen gulped too. It was as alien a thing as one could ever hope to encounter. The shopkeeper placed it on the cushion in front of him, ensuring its stability before removing his hands. Next, we need to burn some incense, he said. A specific combination of oils. The stuff burns long and produces a great deal of smoke, inducing a particular state of mind, Peter, one that, in combination with the box, will, in theory, allow you to commune with Murphy. Commune? Van Melsen asked for clarity. Yes, you'll be a passenger of sorts in the back of Murphy's mind. And this will actually work, will it? The presence of the box will ensure our success, Cook stated with confidence. I have it on good authority that a man of your abilities will have little trouble focusing on Murphy, wherever he is. There's a reason you're drawn to him, Peter. As I said before, I believe he's been reaching out to you. Perhaps, the investigator said, diffidently. But how and why? The answer to those questions awaits you beyond the smoke, old friend. Puffing on his cigarette, Van Melsen retorted, This is the only smoke I put my faith in, Gary. Cook chuckled, climbing to his feet. Navigating the would-be hooker lounge, he collected a sizable incense stick and what looked to be a military-grade gas mask. Returning to the cushion opposite the PI, he donned the mask and withdrew a box of matches from the breast pocket of his shirt. I don't like the look of you in that mask, Van Melsen commented, placing the butt of his cigarette in the ashtray beside him. Nor do I like the look of you through it, Cook returned, his muffled voice sounding 1,000,000 miles away to the investigator's ears. When I light the incense, the shopkeeper continued, take hold of the box. Van Melsen nodded, his heart beating rapidly. And then? He begged of his masked companion. Once you're in there, wherever there is, you'll find yourself attached to Murphy. You must find a way to guide him out, Peter. The little black box is the key to this, or so I'm told. Black and white, Gary, Van Melsen put in cynically, refraining from asking further questions. Though his old friend's strategy was vague and peculiar, he trusted him implicitly. Relax, Cook encouraged. Just think of Murphy. Focus on him. But I've never seen the man's face. His face has nothing to do with it, Peter. Focus on the presence, that presence that continues to haunt you in your dreams. Exhaling slowly, the investigator nodded, bracing himself for the inevitable. Cook lit a match and brought it to the incense stick. In a matter of seconds, the smoke was positively billowing from the thick stick. Plumes of the stuff pervaded the air, filling Van Melsen's nostrils with the unmistakable scent of lavender, amber, and what was that? Devil's snare, perhaps? Cook was rapidly consumed by the wafting vapors. Nothing but the eyes of the gas mask were visible to the investigator, vast and round like the eyes of a giant fly, studying him intently. Blindly, he reached forward in search of the little black box. The moment his naked fingers touched it, he was assaulted by a series of images: cityscapes, seascapes, extensive forests, sandy plains, and a lofty tower, a massive structure piercing the very sky itself, a black sky full of clouds. He coughed and spluttered as the smoke filled his lungs, stripped him of his orientation. He flailed about wildly, the box gripped firmly in his right hand, assaulted by the countless images that dominated his field of vision. "Gary!" he called out, the sound of his own voice instantly devoured by the fumes enveloping him. "Gary!" But the man in the gas mask had disappeared. Or was it Van Melsen that had disappeared? The investigator found himself in the void, an indeterminate space in which only his sense of self remained. Cook's hookah lounge was gone. The intense smoke was gone. Even the little black box that had been firmly clutched in his right hand was gone. He had disappeared. But that was the least of his concerns. Where, exactly, had he reappeared? The renowned paranormal investigator, Peter Van Melsen, was now a passenger in the back of Jason Murphy's mind, who presently was sitting barefoot and cross-legged on an open stretch of tarmac. Part 1. The Flight of Fancy. Jason Murphy couldn't say where it was that he had learned of the idea. Perhaps he'd read of it on an internet forum, or maybe it was scrawled on the wide margins of some 20th century encyclopedia, the kind of heavy volume studied exclusively by those engaged in the loneliest pursuits. Had the idea come to him in a dream? The flat Murphy had occupied for the past 11 years was just a space. It held little value, whereas the idea, that had gnawed away at him for the longest time. And now it was the only thing on his mind, not the dingy tower block on James Street, with its panoramic views across the industrial landscape of West Broughton, not the ghosts of the Revolution, the dimpled hills and the derelict mills, only the idea. It lingered there on the periphery of his consciousness, tempting him with its pledge of brighter tomorrows. And so, one night, he climbed to his feet, strolled to the door of his flat, and stepped out into the cold of a dreary English evening. He didn't even bother to close the door behind him, didn't look back. Not so much as a farewell was uttered, as he walked away from over a decade within its walls. Nor did he bid farewell to his life. Friends were few, family estranged. The young man was a lonely soul on the edge of poverty, a quiet man who preferred to keep himself to himself. His good deeds and moral excellence had done little to enrich his life. Never was he rewarded for his altruism and righteousness. The idea was all that mattered to him now, and at last he'd surrendered to its irresistible call. The young man left James Street behind, wearing only a pair of faded stone-washed jeans and a plain black t-shirt. Barefoot, he winced as he trod upon a piece of broken glass, but it didn't draw blood. On he strolled. Deep into the backwoods he wandered, drawn towards the idea, the abstraction glimpsed in reveries, known as the bridges of slumber. He treaded the flats of the Zark, vast expanses of moorland totally unfamiliar to him, for that which he sought lay beyond the marshland and the barren hills. Guided by gnarled trees and murky skies, he continued doggedly, the passage of time itself giving way to the young man's relentless determination. And eventually, the young man found that which he sought, and in doing so, vanished from the world he'd always known.
"Welcome to the Dreamscape,"
whispered a soft, faraway voice. Murphy opened his eyes. His surroundings were strange. There he was, sitting barefoot and cross-legged on an open asphalt road, surrounded by all manner of vehicles, rust-bitten cars of indeterminate origin, crumpled motorcycles, upturned tramcars, and even the hollow fuselage of an aircraft. Further observations revealed other curiosities. An abandoned fast food kiosk with the name Fisk above it, an upright piano in mahogany, several cardboard boxes filled with videotapes, and a single kaleidoscopic waltzer carriage. Amongst the clutter, he saw bodies, dozens of bodies. Living or dead, he couldn't be certain. Though the fallen figures were motionless, their wide, staring eyes appeared lustrous and aware. Unbeknownst to he who had sought the bridges of slumber, a trio of sharp-suited gentlemen slouched to his rear. As he turned, he was met with their twisted features, arms outstretched, frozen in time. The young man let out a startled cry before promptly rising to his feet. The scene was that of a veritable dystopia. The road on which the new arrival stood stretched as far as he could see. Even in the deep distance, its broad pathways were crowded with vehicular clutter and motionless mannequin men. Towering skyscrapers dominated the scene, reducing the thoroughfare itself to nothing more than a slot canyon. Murphy's eyes followed the facades of the buildings to their dizzying heights, many of which disappeared into the hazy clouds inhabiting the lower atmosphere. Billboards affixed to the towers were plentiful, host to plain descriptions such as bank, mall, and antiquities. Brass street lamps spilled smatterings of soft light onto the scene, the light of day barely reaching the road's surface. All was incredibly quiet, the only sound to be heard the familiar whistle of distant wind. Traversing the detritus, the young man set off in the direction of the aircraft fuselage. North, south, east, or west, it was impossible to tell. He simply moved with the wind. Already, fear was beginning to get the better of him. The repetition was frightening. He would find himself passing the same objects repeatedly: a rusty Ford Prefect, an insect-like Jowett touring car, and the aircraft fuselage. And then a distorted face would meet his eye, its absent glare threatening to undo him completely. The sheer strangeness of the situation had Murphy dumbfounded. "Where the hell am I?" he grumbled, the notion of the bridges of slumber far from his mind. The man in the black t-shirt wandered for what felt like an eternity, and yet the mysterious highway remained unremitting in its repetition. Upturned tramcars, boxes of videotapes, the bank, the mall, and that damned prefect. As Murphy's frustration reached its apex, something in his surroundings changed. Sandwiched between bank and mall, the young man noticed a new addition to the otherwise familiar scene. A small, ill-matched brick building, with a wooden sign hanging from an iron bracket reading, "Books." An unfamiliar voice in the back of his mind instructed him to enter the bookshop. Approaching the store, a low, whistling wind brushed by Murphy, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. A dreary shop window display greeted him, which, judging by the dust and cobwebs coating the items on show, had gone unattended for some time. But the odd and strangely comical titles of several paperbacks immediately caught his attention. The Milking of Goats by J. Cheeseman. Commas in the middle of words by B. Punctuation. What is it with towers, anyway? By B. A. Tallman. And the ridiculously long-winded, an incomplete but nonetheless critical look at the history of totalitarianism in the god-awful, rat-ridden, maggot-infested district of County Bravardis, by Too Many Words. Then Murphy noticed something else. It was a minor thing, really, a scrap of paper in the hands of a wooden dummy, but he felt that he had to have it, whatever it was. Ignoring the sign that read "Closed," he pushed the door open and went after his prize. Inside, the bookshop was hideously dark. It wasn't hard for the young man to envisage dark figures lumbering about in the shadows. He could barely make out the interior. The odd desk and chair here and there, bulky shelves housing hundreds, if not thousands, of books, and innumerable indeterminate objects, both small and large. Clambering onto the poorly assembled shop window display, merely sheets of newspaper over cardboard boxes, he clutched at the hands of the dummy. Retrieving the scrap of paper, he fled like a child, afraid of the thing he was now certain was skulking in the shop's blackened depths. At the speed of sound, he crossed the street and hopped onto the bonnet of a rusty prefect, his gaze returning to the store, its wooden door swinging to and fro on its hinges. Oddly, after leaving the bookstore, Murphy saw that the place appeared to have aged considerably. The shop window was thick with creeping moss, and the sign, barely clinging to the iron bracket now, read, "Boo." The roof tiles had apparently melted, the tired grey slates drooping like the wings of bats over the tarnished facade. The man in the black t-shirt turned his attention to the piece of paper in his hand. He unfurled it, revealing the familiar words within. Step 1. The path begins at you. Open your mind. Let it all go. Glancing up at the tallest towers, Murphy sighed. Though he'd undoubtedly read or heard those words before, he couldn't for the life of him recall their meaning. His recollections were vague and fragmentary. He was still unsure of himself, of who he was and where he was. Compelled by the urge to walk, the young man climbed from the bonnet of the car, pocketed the paper, and eyeballed the interminable highway. The answer to his predicament was out there somewhere, and he was determined to find it, whatever it was. The brilliant, towering symmetry of the alien cityscape filled him with fear and uncertainty, but he didn't hesitate. Thinking of the words on that bit of paper in his pocket, he confidently strode into the unknown. As he went, Murphy ignored the bodies and the vehicles, the banks and the malls, and remained focused on the distant horizon. Slowly but surely, he found himself encroaching upon something new, the end of the road. Beyond the terminus, just visible on the horizon, was an open space, a softly illuminated square. The young man galloped towards it, eager to savor the change of scenery. On reaching the square, Murphy was relieved to have passed beyond the clutches of the impenetrable skyscrapers, to have dodged the last prefect and aircraft fuselage, to have escaped the glare of those innumerable inanimate bodies, the frozen eyes of which had gazed blankly in the direction of this new location. The precinct was considerable. It held the spirit of the colourful old towns of Eastern Europe, such as the Cloth Hall of Krakow, or Sukianitsa, as the young man distantly recalled, but the colour this place might once have held had faded long ago. The square was some 1/2 kilometre in diameter, at the centre of which stood several tired and empty market stalls. Deserted retail outlets formed the area's perimeter, comprising barren bakeries, closed cafes, rotten restaurants, and jaded jewellers. Its bleakness was infectious, as evidenced by the conspiracy of clouds threatening to douse it with water, black clouds filled with an unfathomable rage. On the opposite side of the square, Murphy beheld a huge elliptical arch in Gothic style, a passage beyond waning into darkness. The arch was clearly visible in the soft light, with its bold columns and jewel-encrusted spire at the apex. A ravenous-looking gargoyle was perched atop the spire, its contorted features a note of caution to those seeking entrance to the passage it served to protect. The man in the faded jeans felt drawn towards the arch, but before he could consider moving in its direction, an enormous, lucent orb of water descended from the sky. Some 20 feet wide and the same again high, it hovered above him momentarily, like a giant, watery eye. The lidless sphere gazed at him, transmitting a curious message. "Get ready for the show." In the moments that followed, the ball of water promptly evaporated, and 4 distinct beams of light shot from spotlights in the corners of the precinct, illuminating the night sky. The beams danced an iridescent jig as a marching band entered the square, some 30 strong. Then came the stalls, men and women in gold and red behind them. They served hot dogs and hamburgers, candy floss and toffee apples, and crowds were quick to follow, citizens of all shapes and sizes, all creeds and colours, the denizens of that strange metropolis eager to feast upon the plentiful delights. A dancing troupe was flung from a trapdoor, thrust into the air by something hidden and unseen. Fire-breathers and sword-swallowers, magic men and snake-charmers. The scene was one of joy and merriment, carnival. Murphy simply watched, mesmerized by the spectacle, the dancing, the eating, the performance, the drinking. Then, after what could have been an hour or a day, it was impossible to tell, a chiming bell was heard, rung from a belfry close to the Gothic arch. The marching band ceased, the brilliant spotlights converged on the gargoyle atop the arch, and the crowds, dancers, and performers all shuffled towards it. Silence, bated breath. The citizens of that strange place stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the floodlit gargoyle, frozen, just like the bodies Murphy had passed on the highway. But there was something else amid the men and women gathered there on the square, a presence, and it was in that moment that Murphy realized the crowds were oblivious to him. Not a single person had so much as made eye contact with him. And yet, standing amongst them in the cool evening air, he was cognizant of that strange company, as though another of the anonymous carnival attendees was in fact just like him, an interloper from elsewhere. The young man searched the myriad faces for eyes that saw, expressions that spoke, but neither were forthcoming. To whom that palpable, familiar presence belonged, there was no way for him to tell. The sensation quickly passed, as a realization dawned upon him. The crowds were waiting for the gargoyle to speak. And speak it did, but not before that peculiar ball of water once again fell from the sky. The lucent orb engulfed the gargoyle. Refraction magnified the hideous figure, and an inexplicable current animated it. Enveloped by those abnormal, rippling waters, the figurine addressed its audience. In cracked tones, the stony monster welcomed all to the heart of the city in which Murphy had found himself, New Babylon. The last show of its kind was about to take place on the square, an announcement that drew a sigh from the crowd. The gargoyle babbled on, its features full of expression, as the wave-like surface of the floating orb continued to imbue the sculpture with life. It spoke of change and the difficulties of acceptance, but emphasized the importance of joy and the significance of hope. And as the ball of water threatened to depart, the last peculiar tones to leave the gargoyle's monstrous lips spoke of the pending arrival of the circus. The orb evaporated then, rendering the gargoyle once more inert. Distant melodies were heard, emanating from the depths of the strange highway from which Murphy had recently emerged. The spotlights converged on the great road, as did the fixed gaze of the crowd, and onto the square poured a band of wagons and carriages, surrounded by marching flautists and burly clowns. Smiles lit up the square, as the white faces comprising the circus encircled men, women, and children alike, taunting and teasing playfully. The marching band sprang back to life, the spotlights ignited the sky, and the crowd cheered as the grand spectacle entered its second phase. It was curious. Murphy saw the drummers drum and the audience applaud, felt the heat radiating from their numerous writhing bodies, but he heard nothing. Nothing, that is, except for the circus, the honk of horns and licentious laughter. And though the men, women, and children of New Babylon were totally oblivious to the interloper in their midst, the clowns were not. In a matter of moments, the man in the black t-shirt was surrounded by a dozen clowns, their oversized shoes just inches from his bare feet. They too fell silent. Murphy was frozen to the spot. A blue-faced clown addressed him in hushed tones, saying that the circus had come to sing him a song. The clown's face was peculiar, somewhat lacking in expression, quite possibly incapable of expression. Murphy shuddered. Clowns were superstitious. Blue face paint was meant to be avoided, or so a voice whispered to him from the back of his mind. He fought the temptation to flee, as the waxen figure brushed up against him. Then came the chorus, 12 strong. "We have been waiting to spring this upon you. A mask for your fear you must sport. So much of your person is drawn to the darkness, you must work to safeguard your heart." And then a red-faced clown brushed up against him. Flute in hand, it accompanied the bizarre vocal with an eerie melody. "All that you see is inevitably born of a picture inside. The road to salvation is laid out before you. You must try to open your mind." Concluding their performance, the clowns were quick to retreat. They jumped onto their wagons and promptly vacated the square, returning to the shadowy depths of that fantastic highway. And as the last echo of distant clown horns fell on his ears, Murphy was shocked to find himself standing at the center of an empty square. The spotlights were gone, as were the stalls and the bustling crowd. Everything was as it was before, barren and desolate. Frowning, the young man approached the Gothic arch, the dampness of the stone the only evidence that his recent experiences had actually occurred. Or was it the only evidence? Had the gargoyle's right arm been extended like that, its rigid finger pointing towards a building in the grounds of a murky courtyard to its rear? As dark clouds began to gather overhead, Murphy passed beneath the gargoyle. Into the courtyard he trod, his gaze targeting a tired signpost jutting out of the cobbled earth. It read, "The Theatre." The young man could see the building in some detail now, a huge red-brick monstrosity. Hugging the shadows, surrounded by towering trees, the theatre recalled visions of Moscow's Kremlin. Stained glass windows were scattered across the walls, depicting strange and oddly disproportionate figures. Gaunt faces stared out, their glimmering eyes penetrating the gloom. A vast red onion dome crowned the building, once again evoking visions of Eastern architecture. Then came the rain. The depths of the courtyard were difficult to observe clearly, though Murphy could just about make out the treetops lining the perimeter. Street lamps spilled soft light onto the scene, but failed to illuminate the dim corners. He refrained from gazing at these, spooked by the darkness, just as he had been in the little bookshop on the highway. Crossing the courtyard at speed, the rain soaking him thoroughly, he neared a small flight of steps leading up to the theatre's entrance. A soft gust of wind brushed the nape of his neck as he hastily climbed the steps. Bold lettering above the building's entrance served to remind Murphy that he was about to enter a theatre. Its double doors were a dark, olive green, heavily tarnished, with several inscriptions in a language beyond his comprehension. Each boasted an opaque glass window, as well as time-worn iron handles. An arch above the doors was host to a symbol, 2 cutlasses, one across the other, forming an ornate X. Clutching the handles tightly, he pushed forward with all his might. The doors swung open, and Murphy stepped into a modest foyer. The rain fell violently then, pummeling the doors as they closed behind him. He studied his new surroundings. A large chandelier was the first thing to catch his eye, the 16-nozzle crystal fixture dominating the small space. Its candlelight brightened what little was to be seen in the hall. Hung along the wall to the left were 7 paintings, each the same as its neighbor, depicting a generic, featureless landscape, a rolling hill, a smattering of trees. Below the painting stood a small lectern, host to a piece of laminated paper. It read, "The Landscape." As Murphy studied the paintings, an elderly man spontaneously materialized beside him. The individual was lean, with graying hair, wrinkled brow, piercing eyes, and sporting the most ill-fitting tuxedo a man of advancing years had ever been known to wear. With a warm and inviting voice, he welcomed the young man to the theatre, and spoke of the main exhibition, an item referred to as manifestation. But prior to viewing manifestation, the man added, Murphy was to thoroughly digest the paintings comprising the landscape, paying special attention to subtle differences. Understandably bemused, the man in the faded jeans was just about to inquire as to who the old man was, when the aged gentleman dematerialized in as mystifying a manner as that in which he had appeared. "Look, Jason," came that voice again from the back of his mind. "Look closely." Murphy studied the paintings in the foyer. He looked for subtle differences, but he'd never been particularly fond of Spot the Difference, and so the subtleties, he decided, were probably beyond his detection. Approaching the 7th painting, though, something stirred in his belly. Although it appeared to be a replica of the other 6, there was something familiar about it, something compelling. As he watched, the wooden frame surrounding the image appeared to recede. The once motionless trees in the foreground were coming to life, sprouting grass-green leaves. Luscious fields birthed wild orchids, swaying from side to side. The globule of yellow paint representing the sun was flickering in the azure sky. M-shaped squiggles soared above the hill, their destination some distant, unknowable plain. Murphy was awestruck. He needed to be there. An overwhelming sense of inevitability enraptured him, an urge that would be satisfied if he could but find a way to climb into that painting before him. But the sensation was fleeting, and in a matter of moments all motion in the picture ceased. It was just a painting again, a generic, featureless landscape, a rolling hill, a smattering of trees. But the young man was fascinated. He was eager to feast his eyes on the main exhibition, manifestation. Off he went in the direction of the main hall. The doors to the hall were walnut brown, boasting brass handles in the shape of doves. He clutched the majestic birds, and pushed forward. As the doors swung open, Murphy's gaze fell upon a breathtaking view. The main hall was massive, a grand space, basking in colourful opulence and antique reverence. Hundreds of empty seats sprawled towards the stage, fashioned from oak, furnished in leather, delicately polished. Balconies towered above the parterre, some 4 stories high. From the grand circle to the elegant gods, draped in the finest Victorian furnishings. The marvellous stage, at the bottom of a narrow, descending aisle, called to him. An easel awaited him there, host to what could only be the main exhibition, manifestation. Hesitantly, he set off towards it. The young man's pace was slow, and purposefully so. There was much to absorb. He noted the prominent facets of the theatre's interior, the elegant draperies and crimson curtains of the balconies, the sculptured angels and marble cherubs astride the stage, and the soft, scarlet carpet beneath his naked feet. But despite its beauty and sumptuous comfort, Murphy's fascination was on the wane, owing chiefly to the return of that strange, indefinable presence, the very sensation he'd detected earlier on the open square. Murphy stopped in his tracks. What was once a warm and inviting place was now cold and repellent. His gaze turned to the painting on the stage, the detail of which he was still unable to distinguish. But the source of his trepidation wasn't sitting on the easel. It was elsewhere, watching, waiting. He ogled the angels and the cherubs. No comfort there. Anxiety consumed him. Paranoia tugged at his vitals. Closing his eyes, he silently willed whatever it was to make itself known, a mantra he repeated again and again in his mind. He began to sweat. He was about to scream, but instead, at a heartbeat away from frenzy, he turned sharply and looked upwards. High in the gods, at the very back of the hall, stood a figure, an indistinct, static silhouette. Murphy struggled to perceive the ghostly character. All he could make out was that the figure was wearing a hat of some sort, a fedora, or a trilby perhaps. The individual lingered there, much as he himself was lingering there in the aisle, a standoff of curious proportions. The young man wiped the beads of sweat from his brow, waved a hand, and proffered a hesitant greeting. No reply was forthcoming. Like the lifeless paintings in the foyer and the inanimate bodies on the highway, the figure was frozen in place. But it was very much alive. Murphy could feel its cold gaze passing through him, a penetrating glare that was probing for something hidden in the back of the 31-year-old's mind. But what? Murphy spun on his heel, silently praying that the piercing stare of the stranger was in quest of something on the stage. But the moment he did so, the frosty sensation departed him. Surveying the gods once more, his instincts were confirmed. The mysterious figure had disappeared. Somewhat relieved, Murphy continued along the aisle towards the painting. Dragging himself up onto the stage, he approached the easel. Much to his disappointment, he discovered that manifestation was simply another replica of the paintings he'd seen in the foyer, that generic, featureless landscape, a rolling hill, a smattering of trees. But then, just like before, the wooden frame began to recede, like a snake shedding its skin, and Murphy was drawn towards it, like a moth to a candle flame. The simple blues and greens were slowly replaced with browns and greys, as a new landscape began to manifest. The trees wilted and turned to ash, the grass blackened and turned to dust, the sun in the sky withered and turned to coal, the M-shaped squiggles dropped like stones and disintegrated. The scene was nightmarish. Figures that might have been men lay impaled on pillars of scrap metal. Shapes that might have been buildings rose from piles of accumulated debris. Black towers loomed in the background, like lifeless sentinels above the sinister decay. As the gloom continued to scribble itself onto the hideous canvas, Murphy watched in nervous anticipation as another tower, much taller than the others, took form at the center of the cityscape, its dark, lofty facade calling to the watcher, just as the painting in the foyer had. And again, the young man felt that he needed to be there, standing at the foot of that unlikely structure. But the image was short-lived. In the blink of an eye, the nightmare cityscape was erased, leaving a blank canvas in its wake. Silence pervaded the grand hall. In the quiet moments that followed, the name of the exhibition played on Murphy's mind. Manifestation. Was the desolate cityscape he'd observed a glimpse of something still to come, or merely the result of something predetermined by the artist, whomever he or she was? Regardless, the young man was eager to move on. He'd seen enough of that dreadful canvas to last a lifetime. Gathering his wits, he looked beyond the easel and saw a small neon sign above a door backstage labeled Exit. Abandoning the canvas before him, he strolled to the door and stepped out into darkness. Much to his delight, the rain had stopped. A small flight of stairs led the young man into a narrow alleyway, filled with scraps of newspaper, discarded tin cans, and plastic bags. A questing ant colony plundered the waste, one by one disappearing into a tiny fissure in the ground. High above, eerie beams of moonlight penetrated the oppressive black clouds, dimly illuminating the scene. To his rear, the theatre was now engulfed in thick fog. Only the faintest impression of colourful figures in stained glass could be seen beneath its veil. Murphy crept along the alleyway, his attention drawn to a solitary, glowing street lamp. Scuttling critters moved in and out of the light, roaches and crickets, beetles and spiders. He danced around them, careful not to crush them with his bare feet. Beyond the light of the lamp, he observed the terminus of the alleyway, and soon enough the rangy walls gave way to a small, open waterfront, an enclosed cove surrounded by little wooden huts and rocky outcrops. Stepping onto the harbour, he sensed again a presence to his rear, but this time it belonged to someone else or something else. Turning, he was surprised to be confronted by a cloud of mist, probably formed of the same thick fog that had consumed the theatre some minutes earlier. But unlike regular mist, this veil formed a flat surface, a wall of fog, and it was moving towards him. But as it came within striking distance, it abruptly stopped. Was it conscious, this wall of mist? Was something lurking within, driving it forward? Whatever it was, Murphy sensed that it was benevolent, that it perhaps was there to guide him in some capacity. He felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and touch the mist, but a sudden racket coming from the waterfront stole his attention. The harbour was host to a pier, which in turn housed a number of motorboats, 7 in total. The furthermost boat, dimly visible at the end of the pier, roared as its engine sprung to life. Evidently, there was a passenger aboard. It buffeted and bounced as it set out into the blackness, the rippling, dark waters protesting its company. Murphy called after it, but his cries went unheard as it faded into the spectral night. The man in the faded jeans crossed the harbour and mounted the pier. The wooden slats beneath his naked feet were wet and greasy. It took a great deal of effort to remain steady and upright, but for some unknown reason, he was highly motivated to follow the boat and its mysterious passenger, and so he tiptoed along the length of the pier in search of a boat of his own. Approaching the 6th boat, a black and white coble, Murphy immediately detached the rope from the cleat and haphazardly hopped aboard. The colourless water rocked the boat significantly, the result of some invisible disturbance beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the seemingly conscious wall of mist resumed its course, obscuring the numerous huts and rocks along the shoreline, before once more coming to a halt at the foot of the pier. Murphy's entire world had been reduced to nothing more than a rickety wooden pier, a pool of black water, and 6 unremarkable motorboats. Studying the Coble's rudimentary controls, he felt that it wouldn't be beyond his powers of deduction to start the engine. The essential controls were akin to those found in an automatic car. He climbed into the helm seat, placed his hands on the small steering wheel, and located the ignition device, a simple key lodged in a hole beneath the wheel. Though the key resisted his initial efforts to turn it, it relented under considerable force, and the engine came to life. Gripping the wheel tightly, he sat back and tentatively pushed his foot down. Heedless of the direction in which he was heading, Murphy simply accelerated into the darkness, hot on the heels of the 7th boat and its furtive navigator. The waters calmed somewhat as he moved away from the pier. In a matter of moments, he was utterly consumed by the inky blackness. The cloud cover above was absolute. Steering blindly, he decelerated significantly, wary of what may or may not be floating alongside him out there on the dark waters. Was it a lake he was crossing, a broad reservoir, or some vast oceanic expanse? He had no way of knowing. Either way, it was terribly still and totally grim, shrouded as he was by the velvety night. After some 15 minutes or so of sightless navigation, Murphy killed the engine in order to survey his surroundings. Sitting quietly in the absolute shade, he listened intently, the rhythmic beating of his heart dominating the soundscape. Unfathomably distant though it was, he thought he detected the faintest hint of a motorboat engine. He focused all of his attention on the sound, until he felt reasonably sure of its origin. And so, guided by nothing more than the idea of a compass in his mind, he turned the key in the ignition and accelerated in the general direction of that distant roaring. Over the sound of his own engine, nothing else could be heard. A deep, ominous sense of isolation was starting to get the better of him. He was on the verge of coming undone. But then the clouds began to dissipate, revealing the shimmering moon. A thick haze, glowing yellow in the moonlight, met his eyes. Unlike the strange wall of mist he'd left behind at the waterfront, this fog was truly cloud-like. It surrounded him utterly. But the boat cut through it like a knife through butter, the water vapor dampening his face and hair as he went. Visibility, though, was just as poor as it had been in total darkness. Murphy saw only his hands and the steering wheel in front of him. In the moments that followed, a strange feeling came over the young man. He detected a kind of tipping sensation, the sort of sensation one experiences aboard a log flume prior to its rapid descent into the body of water below. And with the impression came a gust of wind, furthering the notion of an imminent, swift plunge. As the dark waters grew choppy ahead of the boat, Murphy tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes narrowed to slits. But this was just the beginning of his troubles. A clattering and spluttering sound was heard as the boat's engine stalled and promptly failed. The boat was dead in the water, completely vulnerable to the volley of waves now bombarding it. And it was taking on water, too much for the young man to scoop out with his hands. All the while, the turbulent wind continued to churn the waters as Murphy clung to the now defunct steering wheel. Suddenly, a booming, cacophonous roar sounded below the boat, triggering bolder, loftier waves, transforming the dark waters into a bubbling cauldron. The subsurface quake intensified, threatening to tear both the boat and its passenger apart. A tremendous wave drove the boat into the air, and Murphy's saturated hands lost their grip of the steering wheel. Tossed into the back of the little kobold, he braced himself for impact. If the curious sensation of tipping he'd experienced had been a precursor to some unknowable plunge, then the dramatic tilting of the water body now was surely the actualization of that inferred descent. Like a river flowing down a mountain, it sloped at an angle of roughly 30 degrees. Crashing into one of the rear seats, Murphy turned, sat upright, and let out a silent scream as the boat, just like the log on the flume, dropped. And what a ride it was! But rather than culminating in an almighty splash, the boat continued to accelerate towards an unseen target. This, Murphy realized, was because the water body was still tilting, and the rotation persisted as the young man emptied his lungs, praying for divine intervention. But perhaps this was a form of intervention, he thought, an alien method of conveyance through means of topographic transformation. And now the monstrous rotating waterslide had achieved an angle of 45 degrees. Murphy was glued to the seat, his face a mask of fear. 50 degrees, and still the water body continued to tilt. 55 degrees, and Murphy's heart was in his mouth. He simply closed his eyes, willing it to be over. Uncannily, the moment he did so, it all came to an abrupt end. Perhaps the force of gravity acting upon his minuscule frame had induced a hallucinogenic episode of some sort. Whatever it was, the man in the black t-shirt was no longer sitting in the motorboat. Instead, he found himself sitting on a large wooden raft under a blue sky. The raft was floating on a measureless expanse of ocean, completely still under the golden light of the sun. The water surrounding him was perfectly clear. He saw Dorado, Antheus, and Blennies just below the surface, attracted to barnacles growing on the underside of the raft. But there was something else down there too. Was it a body? The thing that floated amongst the Dorado and the Blennies certainly held the impression of a body. The legs and arms, the hands and feet, the head and a mass of long golden hair, the distinctly feminine curves of the torso. The water was so still, and the raft so steady, that Murphy could almost make out the lady's face, a beautiful face, and he saw that she was rising from the depths. And then he saw the arm, pruned and pale. The young man staggered backwards as the unseen lady tightened her grip on the edge of the raft, slowly pulling herself upwards, revealing a second, withered arm, the skeletal hand of which appeared to be clutching something small and indistinct. Then followed the long, golden hair, slick and matted, texture like seaweed, and barnacled. Unexpectedly, Murphy snapped out of the reverie, and found himself sitting rather comfortably in the back of the little motorboat. Cautiously, he sat forward, and slowly climbed to his feet, studying his new surroundings. The boat was docked and attached to another wooden pier, overlooked by an eerie harbour under the soft light of the moon. The quiet waterfront was almost the mirror image of the one he'd left behind. Dilapidated huts and rocky crags along the water's edge, with the exception of a single candle-lit lamp-post standing at the land end of the pier. In addition to his boat, there were 6 others docked alongside it, including the one he'd set out across the stretch of water to follow. And there, beyond the glare of the lamp-post, ambling into what appeared to be a dark forest, Murphy saw the recently disembarked stranger, the man in the hat. He called after the elusive figure, but again His cries fell on deaf ears. The man in the black t-shirt climbed from the boat and stepped onto the pier. In the act of doing so, he glanced back towards the water. But whereas he might have expected to see an expansive lake, he saw only a towering wall of water. The water body, in its grand transformation, had continued to rotate until it achieved 90 degrees, and was now positioned at a perfect right angle to the quiet cove at the end of the pier. And all this, ostensibly, including the docking of his boat, had occurred whilst he lay unconscious in the back of the coble. Divine intervention, indeed. He approached the wall and reached out to touch it. His hand penetrated the surface, just as he expected it to. After all, it was only water. His eyes traced the wall up into the interminable darkness as it faded into oblivion beyond the reach of the dim moonlight. He wondered if New Babylon was up there, looking down at him. With only one direction in which to head, Murphy turned his back to the wall of water and walked the length of the damp pier in his bare, aching feet. He stopped beneath the light of the lamp-post briefly, suddenly conscious of the little scrap of paper in his pocket. He withdrew the note, and once again studied the words printed there. Step 1. The path begins at you. Open your mind. Let it all go. The words now held a greater import, for he remembered what it was to have pursued the idea, the path, to have turned his back on his life, to have freed himself of worldly burdens. But that was just the first step. There were others to rediscover. Murphy looked towards the dark forest. He felt, rather strongly, that the key to understanding his situation lay in the hands of the enigmatic stranger he was now trailing. And as he followed, consumed by the Stygian woodland, a strangely conscious wall of mist emerged from the towering facade of water that overlooked the harbour. "Gary!" called the paranormal investigator, shrouded though he was by white vapour. "Gary! Can you hear me?" And the muffled voice of the shopkeeper Gary Cook sounded from some faraway place. "Peter, I can hear you. Loud and clear, in fact. Where on earth are you?" "Poor choice of phrase, Gary. I appear to be on the edge of Murphy's consciousness. I've managed to reach him a couple of times." "What are you seeing?" Van Melsen, his sense of self vastly reduced, obscured by the racing thoughts of the man in the black t-shirt, described for Cook the journey he was witnessing. "It's a true dreamscape, Gary, incorporating elements of Murphy's personal experiences. I joined him at the very beginning, at the very moment he crossed over, as it were." "Is he aware of you?" "Yes, on some level at least. He's deeply puzzled, though. Some memory loss. We've got a way to go yet, Gary." "Understood. What now?" Cook pressed, the sound of his voice much clearer now. "I'm pushing through. I think I might have found a means through which to walk at the young man's side." "What? How?" "I'm not sure exactly, but it has something to do with the incense. Why do I get the feeling this stuff hasn't been properly tested?" Cook's silence provided Van Melsen with the answer to his question. "I'll check in with you again soon, Gary. If I can, that is." "Okay, Peter. Be careful out there." "You know me, old friend. Careful to the last." And with those closing words, the renowned paranormal investigator, disembodied though he was, pushed against the thick white vapours surrounding him. Part 2. The Transitional Realm. The dusky skies were indiscernible as Murphy glanced upward through the looming canopies and arched branches. Beams of moonlight fought to penetrate the cloudscape, casting a dull luminescence across the quiet forest. The dirt track was made up of gravelly lumps, pebbles and sand, making it challenging to traverse. The track was flanked by giant ferns and trees of varying heights, limbs of oak intertwining with sticks of sycamore, pea-green leaves enclosing delicate caterpillars, and glutinous sap clinging to crinkly bark. The path zigzagged through the forest, its scenery forever changing, dark foliage engulfing statuesque elms and creeping bluegrass afoot stumpy pines. The deeper the man in the black t-shirt tramped, the darker it became, the pebbled footpath continuing to hinder progress, reducing his gait to little more than a shuffling shamble. As Murphy trudged along, his bare feet aching, he caught sight of something in the distance, a pale yellow glow. The light intensified as it neared him, the source of which was evidently a torch or lantern, as the glow was swaying back and forth, as though carried by someone. The young man paused in his tracks, cautious. The outline of a small figure came into focus as it neared him, and within a matter of seconds the figure was clearly visible, a bearded dwarf clutching an oil lamp. Reaching Murphy, the dwarf stopped and held up the lamp in order to get a better look at the young man's face. In doing so, Murphy caught a glimpse of the dwarf's face. It was a rugged set of features, full of deep lines, a brown cabbage-like beard attached to the chin. Small, sunken eyes squinted at him, above which a mound of thick, braided hair hung loosely about his head. A fur coat covered the dwarf from neck to toe, riddled with unusual charms, brooches, tusks, and sharp claws. Oddly, the look the dwarf offered Murphy was one of recognition. Then, turning on his heel, he signalled for the newcomer to follow him. No words were exchanged, as the diminutive figure guided the young man through the woods. The pair walked in silence for a space, until, quite suddenly, the dwarf abandoned the main trail in favour of an imperceptible track through a clump of ferns, beyond which was located an iron gate between two oaks. The dwarf opened the gate, and Murphy squinted in the lamplight in an effort to see what lay beyond. The 31-year-old was led into a little clearing host to a number of shacks, with a roaring fire at its centre. The modest dwellings were lit up by the flames, as were a number of faces. 3 dwarves sat by the fire, 2 of which were dressed in a similar fashion to Murphy's guide, though the third, a large and striking individual, was wearing an elegant scarlet tunic. Upon their arrival, the distinctive dwarf climbed to his feet and approached the pair. Murphy was invited to join the other dwarves by the fireside, next to which one of them was in the act of preparing edibles, namely mugs of beer and skewers of meat. The conversation that followed was ambiguous and bizarre. The dwarf in the scarlet tunic introduced himself as Red, and attempted to explain, in as few words as possible, the nature of the world in which Murphy had found himself. The dwarf described the Dreamscape as a transitional realm, a world between worlds, in which mankind's recognized laws of nature might not necessarily apply. Reaching into a concealed pocket, Red withdrew a richly coloured meerschaum pipe and a unique pocket lighter with the letter R engraved on it. He rolled the lighter's thumb wheel and lit the pipe. After a few spluttering puffs, his address continued. "You're not the only one to stroll through here tonight, you know," came Red's throaty tones. "There's another. Better watch yourself, boy." "I think I've seen him," Murphy stated. "Wears a hat?" Puffing on his pipe, Red said, "Mark my words, boy. Better watch yourself. You're not going after him, are you?" "Well," Murphy began, shrugging his shoulders, "after everything that's happened to me today, I figured the company couldn't hurt." "Lucky you ran into us, then," the dwarf scoffed, ogling the man in the black t-shirt. I reckon so, Murphy agreed, accepting a mug of beer handed to him by one of the other dwarves. A period of silence ensued, in which the dwarves focused on their mugs of beer and the skewers of meat, a dark meat that Murphy politely refused to eat. "I've got some directions for you," Red offered, and proceeded to outline a way out of the forest. Murphy was to follow a faintly illuminated track in the direction of a small settlement by the name of Vokar, in order to obtain counsel at the House of Solutions. He would know he'd reached the town upon sight of the artist Bilbezbo's famous reptilian humanoid monument. Some 20 feet in height it was. Bilbezbo was a Vokar native, a deranged sculptor, whose affinity for reptiles had ultimately led to his death, when, in an effort to appraise the texture of crocodile hide, he'd become a carnivore's lunch. Another period of silence followed, the dwarves gulping and chewing, Murphy preparing himself for the journey ahead. What the House of Solutions was, the young man hadn't the vaguest idea, but the words of the now inebriated dwarf resounded like a broken record in his bewildered mind. Seek out the House of Solutions, obtain counsel. Spurred on by the notion, he climbed to his feet and bade farewell to the party of dwarves. "Go well, Jason," muttered Red, puffing smoke into the air. "I will," Murphy replied. "Thanks for the beer." The dwarves simply nodded as the young man took off in the direction of the dim track. Negotiating the trail, Murphy observed that the faint radiance illuminating the track in uniform fashion was composed of fireflies, each of which appeared to be obeying some uncanny law, some hidden voice whose command was evidently urgent enough to warrant acquiescence. There was something unnatural at work, the young man mused, but pressed on regardless, guided by the soft glow of the beetles. Eventually, Murphy reached the edge of the forest, where beyond he saw the promised sculpture, Bilbezbo's reptilian humanoid. The thing was hideousness personified, irregular scales like ocean waves, teeth like cemetery stones, black eyes like bottomless wells. If such a thing had lived, the mere sight of it would surely have been enough to slay Bilbezbo long before that ill-fated encounter with the crocodile. The monstrosity was enclosed by a courtyard comprising ugly rock walls, uncut stones piled on top of one another haphazardly. Waning moonbeams accentuated the terrible curves and lines of both the statue and the surrounding courtyard. It was a ghastly place, and Murphy hesitated before swiftly crossing the space in the direction of a large archway on the far wall. To the left of the archway, clearly visible above the piecemeal walls, loomed a wide stone tower, some 60 feet tall, a structure eerily familiar to Murphy. It resembled a rather distinctive building, located in his hometown of West Broughton, known as Santall Tower. Santall Tower stood in isolation atop the town's highest peak, instilling fear in the imaginations of the young and the impressionable, with its moss-green walls and crown of crumbling stones. It had been a water tower in its youth, a pressurized water supply system constructed during the Industrial Revolution. But later, in the early 1930s, a tragic flood led to the tower's closure, and as a result, the building fell into a state of disrepair. Naturally, the landmark inherited a reputation. Intrigued by the haunted tower on the hill, children flocked to the building throughout the late 30s, 3 of whom eventually managed to gain access to its forbidden interior. Michael Weathergreen, James Turner, and Alice Anforth bypassed the poor security measures, namely a metal fence and a gate labeled Keep Out, and crawled into a drainage duct. The duct led directly into the heart of the building, which, unfortunately, was still partially flooded. And there, in the darkness, the three teenagers mysteriously drowned, and were only discovered several days later, when an eyewitness came forward claiming to have seen them heading towards the tower on the day of their disappearance. In the years that followed, dozens of similar stories abounded concerning Santal Tower, all of which were committed to local folklore, told and retold to subsequent generations, Jason Murphy included. And so, that ugly stone tower on the edge of Vaucar served as a horrible reminder of childhood terrors. Averting his gaze, the shoeless man ducked into the large archway and continued along a narrow stone passage. Emerging at the opposite end, Murphy found himself standing at the center of what could have passed for a town in America's Old West. But not the real Old West. Far from it. A mere facsimile, as encountered on the set of a movie. The facades of the wooden structures were facades only, wooden boards supported by cumbersome beams and scaffolds. The windswept scene before him was entirely unfathomable. Golden-brown, sun-baked grass sprawled across the street, crawling up through uneven slabs and loose stones. Kerosene lanterns hung from wrought-iron hooks, gently flickering in the moonlit darkness. Abandoned wagons lay partially buried in the sand, toasted and useless. Across the street, Murphy observed two wooden arrows affixed to a freestanding signpost. The arrow pointing to the right read West, Cran, and the arrow pointing to the left read East, House of Soul. Guided by the words of the dwarf in the scarlet tunic, the young man followed the latter. A gentle wind tickled his bare feet as he traversed the replica ghost town. Indifferently, his eyes fell on the false storefronts and the flickering lanterns suspended from them. And, after strolling some 200 feet eastward along the dusty highway, he found himself within striking distance of an impostor, a structure unlike the others, a facade in possession of a tangible surface area and solid brick walls. A small, round window overlooking the street emitted a soft, white light, its glow revealing a tired-looking rocking chair positioned on the porch beneath it. A rickety sign above saloon-style doors read, House of Solutions. As Murphy approached the building, the white light blinked out, so that only the dim ruddiness of the highway's numerous lanterns aided him in reaching the entrance. Pausing before the doorway, he hesitated. What was he to do? Knock? Shout? Or simply stroll on in? Could he trust the word of the enigmatic Red? Where was that voice in the back of his mind when he needed it? The young man listened for sounds of activity beyond the threshold. He detected a faint squeaking, a subtle rocking back and forth, and his eyes were immediately drawn to the dilapidated rocking chair beneath the window. Someone, or something, was waiting for him within, an individual perched on a similar piece of furniture. Running a hand through his greasy hair, Murphy inhaled deeply and entered the House of Solutions. The murky space in which he found himself was difficult to discern. He felt the rough surfaces of wooden planks beneath his feet and winced as a shrill creak announced his entrance. Ahead of him, in the darkest recesses of the room, he was able to perceive the outline of a sizable rocking chair, upon which, as he had surmised, sat an indeterminate figure, now entirely motionless. Cautiously, Murphy took a step in the direction of the silent shape, before thinking better of it, and chose instead to proffer an introduction. As he did so, the being acknowledged his arrival by opening its eyes, and those wide sockets emitted soft, white light, evidently the source of the glow he'd seen from the street. Instantly, the room was brightly lit up, and Murphy saw all that there was to see. Bare brick walls, free of embellishment, and the highly polished arms of the oak rocking chair upon which the figure sat. But the source of the light, the hulking being emitting the glare, was now completely imperceptible. Only the edges of the black robes adorning it were visible under its incessant gaze. In a strange, guttural voice that sounded infinitely distant to Murphy's ears, the being introduced itself as Gertrude. Then it leaned back in the chair and rocked back and forth for a stretch. Its eyes, those bright, illuminated spheres, moved up and down like spotlights, assessing its present company. In turn, the man in the faded jeans took another step forward. Eventually, Gertrude ceased its rocking and proceeded to offer Murphy a solution to a problem. "Seek out the unfamiliar within the familiar," it began in a strange, heavy voice. "Find that untrodden road or footpath. Seek out unfamiliar trees and unfamiliar plains. Walk under strange stars and mysterious moons." And Murphy found that he'd heard those words before. "This is the second step," Gertrude continued. "But you already know that, don't you?" The young man nodded, for he did know. He recalled what it was to have trodden the flats of the Zark, to have strayed beyond the familiar. The second step had led him to the bridges of slumber. "Then hear this," the great being whispered, its voice low and barely audible. "You must rediscover the third step. Go home. Look to he who has come for you." And with that vague, concluding statement, Gertrude closed its eyes and returned to that weird state of stillness in the darkness of the House of Solutions. Baffled, Murphy turned, his eyes once more adjusting to the gloom. Approaching the saloon door, he stepped back out onto the street. But the street had changed. Nothing remained of the mock town of the Old West. The wooden facades and kerosene lanterns had been condemned to oblivion. Instead, Murphy was met by two perfectly rectilinear rows of terraced houses, neatly intersected by a seemingly endless tarmac highway. Each and every house, as far as the eye could see, was the exact duplicate of its neighbor. 2 stories, red brick, slate roof. The young man quickly realized that the building from which he'd emerged seconds earlier had now gone the way of the replica ghost town. It was nowhere to be seen. It was as though he'd been instantaneously transported from one location to the next, in the blink of an eye. Perhaps the strange blink of Gertrude's eyes. "Go home," it had said. And now he'd been whisked away from that place, and there was something uncomfortably familiar about the thoroughfare on which he found himself. The sky above was dark and cloudless, starless and moonless, yet an ethereal, violaceous hue seemed to hang in the night air, the source of which was impossible to determine. Murphy, tired and confused, set off along the middle of the road. There was nothing to mark his progress, no distinctive landmarks, no change in the sky overhead, just the road and the houses, every last one identical, right down to the finest detail. The red brick walls, the double-glazed windows, the lanky chimney pots, the oxblood wooden doors. Approaching a dozen or so of the duplicate properties, the young man concluded that all of them were empty. Dark, vacant spaces with featureless walls and inappropriately gargantuan fireplaces, like gaping, malnourished mouths. Once more, Gertrude's words returned to him. Go home. Where was home, exactly? He stopped and seated himself on a portion of interminable curb. Sitting there quietly, he mimicked the final action of the great being in the dark, and closed his eyes. Go home. Murphy meditated on the notion. What is home? He thought long and hard about it, and eventually identified his own definition of home, what it meant to him, and where he would always consider it to be. And it was in that moment of peaceful contemplation, and perhaps due to the revelatory nature of his conclusion, that once again the world about him began to change. The young man opened his eyes. The violet haze turned a deep crimson. The red bricks darkened. The chimney pots shrank. The window frames expanded. Familiar lampposts sprung from the earth like grass, quickly achieving the height of the houses, before sprouting dim, orange bulbs. And then a building from Murphy's past appeared on the horizon, rushing toward him with the momentum of a steam locomotive. The young man climbed to his feet. The oncoming house ground to a halt before him, as, without warning, a cloud of luminous vapor descended from the empty sky, enclosing the scene in a large, shimmering dome. And that wasn't all. Floating above him was a curious translucent sphere, about the size of a tennis ball. But Murphy was too distracted to focus on the orb. The ghostly house in his midst held his attention completely. It was home, his first home, the home in which he spent his childhood. The house was a modest terrace, at least it should have appeared as such, had the luminous dome not isolated it so. The familiar brickwork and slate roof was just as he remembered it, basic and typical of the late 19th century. He gazed fixedly at the front door, studying the years of wear and tear, including the distinctive indentation in the wood, where he once, accidentally, threw a cricket ball. Affixed to a panel above the door was the number 10 in bold, striking brass. He noted the white, wooden window frames, ever so carefully maintained by his mother, the scent of fresh paint filling his nostrils at the memory. On the other side of the windows, the curtains were closed, masking the interior, but the lights were on, suggesting that someone was home. The quiet yard, comprising flagstones and potted plants, beckoned Murphy. He shuffled forwards, his bare feet brushing against dead leaves sprawled across the yard. "Go home," Gertrude had said, and there he was, approaching the door of 10 Beefold Lane, a house he hadn't laid eyes upon in over a decade. How baffling, how unexpected. The translucent sphere followed Murphy, floating just to the rear of him, like an inquisitive apparition. Stepping inside, the young man allowed the heavy door to close by itself, as, in silence, he studied a scene from the past. The living room into which he strode was a perfect recreation of a time gone by, a time when, if his memory served correctly, he would have been a teenager. The open room was filled with familiar items, a 3-seat red leather sofa and 2 matching armchairs, a neatly polished coffee table strewn with miscellaneous newspapers and TV magazines, a large bulky television atop a pine corner unit, an overbearing brick fireplace filling the entirety of the leftmost wall. Above the fireplace was positioned an elaborate cuckoo clock, a centerpiece much beloved by his mother. The room, it would seem, was an ode to the rose, the perennial in multiple colors, decorating carpets, curtains, and wallpaper alike, twisting and intertwining, inundating the room. But most telling of all, a number of cards had been placed neatly across the fireplace, each in celebration of Murphy's 18th birthday. The man in the black t-shirt had stumbled into the memory of 1991. Nostalgia had him in its grip, and as such a wave of excitement washed over him as he thought of his bedroom. He passed through the silent living room, along the back of the leather sofa, and mounted the stairs at the opposite end. Up he went, his eyes drawn to the numerous photographs decorating the wall to his right. He was the subject of all of them, From the child of 2, whose first word was toaster, to the boy of 16, whose expression spoke of the joy he felt, having completed secondary school. At the top of the stairs, his bedroom was situated at the end of a short corridor to the left. With the luminous sphere hot on his heels, he followed the corridor enthusiastically, and was unable to contain an audible chuckle upon sighting the familiar warning sign affixed to his bedroom door, "My room, not yours." Oddly, his bedroom light switch was located in the corridor. This had given his mother some degree of control over his supposed bedtime, though she hadn't been able to do much about the portable television. Murphy flicked the switch and watched as a band of light appeared at the base of the door. Gripping the stiff door handle, he turned it and pushed. Much to his surprise, the room was incredibly tidy. Not a thing was out of place. To his immediate left, he saw his old computer desk, host to a Commodore Amiga and an unbranded CRT monitor. To the right of the computer desk, towering above it, was a bulky, white wardrobe covered with colorful stickers pertaining to popular music of the time. And to the right of the wardrobe, along the length of the adjacent wall, was a single bed, immaculately made, its pillows plumped. The young man approached the old bed and sat down. It was incredibly malleable and soft. It practically consumed him upon contact. Glancing at the pillow end, he noticed a small teddy bear. Carefully, he gripped the toy and gazed at it. It was about the size of a pint mug, wearing denim dungarees and an eye patch. Without thought, Murphy hugged the bear. He couldn't help himself. It was Brian the bear, his childhood friend. But then a thought occurred. Was Brian the bear still a part of his life in 1991? And the answer to that question was no. Brian the bear had been lost in a supermarket some 9 or 10 years earlier. Besides, the 18-year-old Murphy had little time for toys. The starkness of the bedroom bore witness to the fact. Something else was at work here, but in that quiet moment he didn't care. He lay down on the bed and placed Brian next to him as his head hit the pillow. Closing his eyes, he allowed his recent experiences to cloud his mind. He saw the staggering towers of New Babylon and the motionless bodies that littered its deserted streets. He recalled the great square and the chattering gargoyle, the unsettling clown chorus. He returned to the theatre, wherein that elusive man in the hat had studied him from the gods. He shrank from the memory of his oceanic adventure, the rotating water body from which he had unaccountably escaped. He heard the voice of the dwarf, Red, felt the heat from the fire, the strangeness of their tete-a-tete. He recoiled from the reptilian statue and floated through the replica ghost town. He listened to the being, Gertrude, in the House of Solutions. All of it, every last detail, seemed to have served a single purpose, to guide him home. And just like that, he opened his eyes and immediately located the mysterious orb floating above him. "What are you?" he asked, noting the way the sphere appeared to be shimmering. "Are you trying to communicate with me?" The orb returned a series of flashes, but the sequence meant nothing whatsoever to the man on the bed. "Any idea what I'm doing here?" Again, a series of flashes. "Is there something I'm supposed to find here?" Flash, flash. But that was the limit of Murphy's queries for the present. His tired eyes closed, and he drifted into a deep slumber. Murphy was dreaming of a precipitous crag in the depths of a vast cavern. A man was atop the peak, his attention fixed on a giant, slow-moving airship below, floating above an enormous body of water. Scattered beams of light lit the strange scene, emphasizing the numerous curves and lines of the floating vessel. A prod at Murphy's shoulder roused him from the ambiguous dream. He shot up on the bed, looking from left to right, as the vision of the stranger at the top of the cliff promptly faded. And then his eyes fell on the young boy in his midst, the child, who just moments before had stirred him from his slumber. Several seconds elapsed before recognition set in. The boy was himself, a much younger version of himself, but not the Jason Murphy of 1991. This was more like the Jason Murphy of 1981. Murphy's younger self examined him with wide, bright eyes, eyes full of luster and innocence, eyes unblinkered by the devastating truths of adulthood. A mound of curly hair crowned the boy's head, engulfing his eyes and ears. Standing over Murphy, with a look of determination stamped on his face, the boy gestured towards the bedroom door, muttering something about a painting in the dining room. The man in the black t-shirt sat up and climbed to his feet. As he did so, a vague memory surfaced. In his mind's eye, he saw the dining room, wherein his late father often sat by an easel, but the recollection was fleeting. The boy led his older self out of the room, claiming that a stranger had entered the house, wandered into the dining room, and climbed into the painting above the fireplace, just as one might climb through a window. But there was more, the boy said. The stranger was now a part of the painting, a dark silhouette perched on a lonely peak. Murphy followed the boy downstairs and into the dining room. Further memories returned to him. His father had referred to the dining room as the library, as evidenced by the vast and numerous bookshelves covering the walls. It was in the library that his father liked to paint, inspired by the many volumes surrounding him. Murphy's eyes fell upon the spines of various books, from rosy-hued leather-bound occult grimoires whose names included the Heptameron and the Key of Solomon, to the iridescent dust jackets of the classics, including the complete works of Algernon Blackwood and H.P. Lovecraft's Dream Cycle. Hanging above the mantelpiece in the center of the room was the painting the boy had evidently been referring to, a painting all too familiar to Murphy. But its familiarity wasn't due to some distantly recalled memory. It was owing to the generic landscape he'd laid his eyes on in the theater, a rolling hill, a smattering of trees. Was this the original work? His father's work? On closer inspection, just as the boy had inferred, he saw the indistinct silhouette standing on top of the hill. Was that figure wearing a hat of some sort? Murphy immediately concluded that the outline belonged to the very same elusive individual he'd pursued across the rotating water body, the character the dwarf, Red, had warned him about. The two Murphys gazed at the man in the painting, and the man in the painting gazed back. The elder of the two announced that he was going to climb in after him, in spite of Red's warning, to go in search of the unfamiliar within the familiar. His younger counterpart frowned. Approaching the fireplace, Murphy studied the painting minutely. It truly was a window, a door to another place. A subtle warmth met his fingertips as he extended an arm towards it. Mounting the mantelpiece, he turned to face his younger self and smiled reassuringly. The boy held up a hand and waved. Inhaling deeply, the man in the faded jeans and black t-shirt leapt into the painting. The translucent sphere that he'd all but forgotten about followed forthwith. "Gary!" Van Melsen called into the ether. "Peter!" sounded the muffled voice of Cook. "What's happening?" The disembodied investigator was preparing for the final push. He'd successfully managed to detach himself from Murphy's troubled mind, but the ball of vapor to which he now belonged was making communication with the young man even more difficult. "Murphy and I are now separated," Van Melsen stated, acutely focused on the strange painting above the fireplace in Murphy's childhood home. "I have a presence now," he continued, "but I must transcend this new form if I'm to walk beside him." "Tell me all you can, Peter," Cook insisted. "Murphy's subconscious is spilling out, Gary. We're seeing tantalizing glimpses of his past. It's very seductive. I sense that something wants to keep him here, or at the very least, distract him." "Something?" "There's someone else here in the dreamscape. Someone who might very well have some influence over the place. Furthermore, Murphy is on the trail of this individual. He's drawn to him somehow." "Him, Peter?" "Yes. I haven't managed to get a good look at him, but I'm certain this individual is leading us somewhere. And I say us, for I'm all but convinced that he's aware of my presence too." "What do you think he's after?" came Cook's distant tones, decidedly anxious. "I'm sure he'll let us know soon enough, but I don't like the smell of it." There was a lengthy pause before the masked shopkeeper responded. "You'd better press on, Peter," he said. "You've a lot to accomplish." "Isn't that the truth?" said the P.I., readying himself for the plunge ahead of him. "But what an adventure, eh?" The immaterial man heard only the distant chuckle of his masked friend as he willed himself towards the painting. Moments later, Gary Cook vanished entirely from Van Melsen's perception, as the ball of vapor penetrated the intangible membrane dividing two worlds. Emerging on the other side, the sphere promptly dissolved, spilling from its innards the unmistakable physical form of the renowned paranormal investigator. Part 3. The Noble Act. As Murphy fell from the open sky, a majestic silence enveloped him. Though gravity drew him down, pulling his body ever closer to the green landscape below, he felt no fear. A startled rabbit caught a glimpse of the falling figure, then scurried into the undergrowth, the only witness to his graceful arrival on the sprawling carpet of grass. And graceful it was. The young man came to rest on his back, like a feather dropped from the heavens. Far above him, he could just about make out the floating picture frame through which he'd leapt. Was that a small hand that waved from within? A hand belonging to his younger counterpart, perhaps? He returned the gesture, then climbed to his feet, in order to get a better look at his surroundings. The scene was quite beautiful. Rolling hills met Murphy's gaze, host to towering oaks and leaf-strewn horse-chestnuts. Clusters of bluebells dotted the plains, gently bobbing in the breeze, a breeze that appeared to be puffing in a very particular direction. 7 pure white doves briefly eclipsed the sun, obeying the allure of that gentle wind. They flew towards a distant spire, nestled in the reaches of a wide valley between the hills. The waning sunlight reflected from the spire's shiny apex, indicating a route towards it through a patch of woodland in the vale. High above, a group of mischievous clouds raced across the sky, blotting out what remained of the fading sun. The valley was plunged into shadow, but the young man wasn't deterred. The stranger he had glimpsed atop the hill in the painting was nowhere to be seen, but Murphy felt certain that he would catch up to the man in the hat if he followed the wind. Enjoying the sensation of the soft grass beneath his bare feet, he took off in quest of the now hazy spire. Darkness gathered as Murphy entered the vale. The trees surrounding him loomed like scarecrows, their awkward limbs outstretched like gnarled, pointing fingers, urging him onwards. And through the branches the gentle wind shrieked, like the desperate screech of a dying owl. The woods grew darker and darker, till all was monochrome, a realm of shade through which the young man tiptoed, becoming increasingly aware of a presence to his rear. Were eyes upon him? He couldn't be sure, but a handful of paces ahead he perceived a substantial clearing, in which the spire, a golden tower amid a huddle of indistinct houses, awaited him. Stepping into the clearing, the man in the black t-shirt observed a number of candle-lit lanterns on the verge of burnout, indicating the perimeter of what appeared to be a small village. Despite the onset of night, aided by the relentless clouds above, the village was calm and inviting. The nagging impression of eyes on his back had departed for the time being, leaving him free to ask of nobody in particular, "Where am I?" The houses dotted about were little more than log cabins, with thatched rooftops and barn-style sliding doors. Oval windows adorned the dwellings, dark curtains masking their interiors. Penetrating the rooftops were stone chimneys, coughing plumes of white smoke into the air. Murphy counted a dozen houses in all, through the middle of which, ending at the golden spire, ran a gravel pathway. The young man stepped onto the path, contemplating the strange street lamps lighting it, wooden posts crowned with candles, thick with wax dripping. Looking up at the imposing spire, Murphy was humbled by it. At the base of the structure was a wooden door, above which the young man saw once again two cutlasses, one across the other, forming an X, just as he'd seen above the entrance to the theatre in New Babylon. "Sanctuary," he mumbled, as though the meaning of the symbol was exactly that. Halfway up the spire, aligned with the oaks at the clearing's perimeter, Murphy studied the plain clock face situated there. Unmoving, the large hands displayed 7 minutes past 11. Two sinister-looking cherubs were positioned astride the clock face, their stony eyes fixed on the frozen hands. At the top of the golden steeple sat another ravenous-looking gargoyle, just like the one he'd given audience to in the heart of New Babylon. Murphy heard voices. From where the sounds issued, the young man couldn't be certain, but he turned his attention to the nearby houses and saw ruffling curtains, the hidden occupants therein suddenly interested in his coming. The inaudible muffling continued unabated for several seconds, whilst the denizens of the cabins retreated from their oval windows and shuffled towards their fireplaces. Immediately thereafter, the billowing plumes of smoke ceased, and arose instead the unified voices of a dozen villagers, chanting as follows. A quiet boy roamed a quiet town. His thoughts were sound, his daydreams loud. The quiet boy met quiet souls. A noble act made the quiet boy whole. All fell silent. Turning to examine the clock face, Murphy saw that the hands remained stuck at 7 minutes past 11. The candle-lit street lamps had grown dim, badgered as they were by an expanding haze. Perplexed by the verse of the villagers, the young man proceeded along the gravel pathway, wincing with every step as the rough stones came into contact with his bare feet. Reaching the spire's wooden door, the man in the black t-shirt observed a strange spectacle. The crossed cutlasses above the door began to melt. The molten metal ran in a stream down the front of the door, following a network of grooves along its surface. Terminating in the middle of the door, it solidified again, forming the unmistakable shape of a human hand. The silver hand was situated as one inviting a handshake might proffer a palm, open and enticing. Murphy approached the hand and shook it. Instantly, the metal hand disintegrated and fell to the floor. Then the wooden door, of its own volition, opened inwardly, revealing a tenebrous space beyond. Tentatively, Murphy entered the structure, mindful of the oppressive silence pervading it. His footsteps made the slightest of sounds as he crept across the cold stone floor into what resembled the nave of a church. Outlandish frescoes adorn the windowless walls, huge, iridescent spheres pursuing terrified men and women across barren cityscapes, monstrous crab-like creatures guzzling marine life from massive lake beds, and gaunt, emaciated human beings suspended from the branches of crooked trees, begging for death. Shuddering, the young man averted his gaze from these horrors. Passing a number of empty pews, Murphy approached a raised pulpit at the far end of the nave. Climbing its short flight of steps, he mounted the podium and discovered a dusty volume lying open on the bookstand. The book, untitled as it was, concerned a race of people known as the Tenators. Occupants of the great realm of Gati, the Tenators were wiped out following a bizarre event involving the coming of a mysterious stranger. The stranger was a woman, went the text, a woman in possession of a strange machine. She offered the machine to the Tenators as a gift. Freeing herself of it, the woman promptly disappeared, leaving the Tenators to agonize over the nature of the thing. An elder, by the name of Beckner, proposed the notion that the stranger's gift was intended to aid in the Tenators' technological advancement, and so a young scientist called Treathen was employed to reverse engineer the little black box. Her name was Pimpernella, came a voice from across the nave. Murphy, startled, looked up. His eyes narrowed, searching for the source of the voice. She descended into an ancient sanctum to rouse the old ones, sounded the voice again. But she wasn't prepared for what she disturbed down there. The old ones took control of her, infused the little black box with the verminous dark ones, and drove her to commit a terrible act of iniquity. "Who are you?" Murphy called, seeing only the suggestion of a person in the far, hazy recesses of the nave. "A friend," answered the man in the shadows, stepping into the light. "Do I know you?" the young man begged, sensing recognition on some level. "I'm here to help, Jason," said the man with the gaunt face, his eclectic dress suggestive of a character from a Hammer horror movie. "The name's Peter Van Melsen." Murphy searched his memory. Though he was sure he'd never seen the man's face before, he was sure he'd heard his voice before. But where had he heard it? "Where did you come from?" the man in the black t-shirt asked, watching the approaching figure closely. "To coin a phrase, it's a long story," Van Melsen stated, offering the young man in his midst a broad, toothy grin by way of reassurance. "But if you'll give me the time of day, I'll do my best to bring you up to speed." Nodding, Murphy collected the untitled book and descended from the pulpit. "Let's head outside," the investigator suggested. "One of the villagers has very generously offered to brew us a pot of tea." "Tea? Here?" blurted the young man. "You'll find there's little you need to go without round here, Jason. It's just a case of adapting to the environment." Wide-eyed and mystified, the man in the black t-shirt approached the man in the long black overcoat, and together they went after that much-needed pot of tea. Murphy sat facing the mysterious Peter Van Melsen in the quaint living room of an elderly lady by the name of Hilda. The senior had rushed out to greet the PI, convinced he was a former resident of the village, absent for generations. Unfortunately for Hilda, though, it was a simple case of misidentification. Still, she'd greeted the stranger warmly, inviting both him and the man to whom the villagers had recited a traditional verse for tea.
"Welcome to Moppen,"
Hilda said, pouring a cup of pine needle tea for the barefooted man.
"What happened to your shoes?"
she asked, an expression of befuddlement across her wrinkled visage. Left home without them," Murphy returned, shrugging.
"You'll catch your death,"
the old lady stated, returning a shrug of her own. Waving the cup of hot tea under his nose, she added,
Better drink this.
Then, turning to the grinning, gaunt investigator,
And I don't know what you're smirking at, mister. That pasty face of yours could do with a spot of colour.
It was Van Melsen's turn to shrug. As Hilda shuffled away, the PI turned to Murphy, who was still clutching the untitled book he'd retrieved from the spire. That machine you were reading about, the little black box, the investigator began. I have it in my possession. The young man looked up, evidently intrigued. Really? Indeed, Van Melsen confirmed. Without it, I wouldn't have known what it was you were reading. You have it with you? Murphy pressed. Van Melsen hesitated. Well, sort of. Sort of. It's complicated. Isn't everything? The young man stated, shaking his head. Sipping his tea gingerly, the investigator nodded at the book on Murphy's lap. The young scientist, Treathen, Van Melsen said, ultimately failed in his attempts to reverse engineer the strange machine. He did, however, prior to the Black Light event, as it was afterwards termed, suggest that there might be a way to open it. Treathen succeeded in this regard, which disastrously unleashed the Dark Ones, resulting in the elimination of his people. How do you know all this? Murphy ventured. The box, Jason, the investigator stated carefully. It communicates with me. I've learned a great deal from it, though I sense that the information it chooses to convey is directly linked to my current objective. What is your objective? Murphy begged, sipping his tea. To guide you out of here, Jason. Why? I chose to come here. True, Van Melsen admitted, though isn't it also true that you haven't the slightest clue as to where you are and why you chose to come here? The young man nodded as memory fragments floated to the fore of his consciousness, bits of half-remembered dreams in which he would wander unending plains in search of some mysterious prize, guided by the disembodied voice of a stranger. The recollections disturbed him, felt far too familiar, as he looked upon the face of the gaunt individual in his midst. And that was the source of the stranger's familiarity. Not too long ago, Van Melsen had been in his head. Have you any idea how long you've been here? The investigator quizzed. The man in the black t-shirt shook his head. A day? Half a day? He muttered. Feels like forever. You've been here for years, Jason, the investigator stated. Over a decade, in fact. What? Murphy exclaimed, almost spilling his tea. You disappeared in 2004. It's 2018 now. The young man simply shook his head in bemusement. Van Melsen commented, A long day out in the Dreamscape, eh? The conversation between the young man and the investigator continued, Murphy doing his best to outline the nature of the strange dreams that had resulted in his happening upon the Dreamscape, and Van Melsen attempting to plunder the depths of the dreamer's subconscious in order to fish out the details pertaining to the mysterious 4 steps. If we're to succeed in getting you out of here, Van Melsen said, we need to know what those other steps are. There are 4, Jason. The first 2 provided a means for you to cross over. Stands to reason steps 3 and 4 might provide a way back. Then in walked Hilda, her eyebrows raised.
Blimey,
the old lady started.
Seems you've got to spell it out to some folk.
Excuse me, Van Melsen returned.
Listen,
Hilda continued, ogling Murphy.
A quiet boy roamed a quiet town. His thoughts were sound, his daydreams loud. The quiet boy met quiet souls. A noble act made the quiet boy whole.
A noble act, Murphy repeated, his eyes wide. I remember now. Peter, I remember. Step 3, the noble act. There are those in need of your help. Assist them. This does relate to getting out of here. I'm sure of it." Nodding, the old lady pointed at the untitled book sitting on the young man's lap.
"It's all in there, young man,"
she said, then shuffled away again. "The tenators," Van Melsen put in. "How can you assist a vanished race?" Eagerly, Murphy opened the book and leafed through its weighty pages. He read as follows. "The strange machine put an end to the great realm of Gati. Buildings turned to coal, people to dust. Skies darkened. A charred wasteland, Gati's marvellous skyscrapers were reduced to scorched lumps. Meadows flat and featureless, lake beds dry and cracked. Only the citadel remained, a wonder at the heart of a dead world." Murphy paused, seeking comfort in his pine needle tea. "Visitors to this dead place," he continued, "speak of the realm's new inhabitants, beings that have come to be known as the Dark Ones. They live in Gati's murkiest corners, its shadows, its derelict, windowless ruins. One would be foolhardy to plunder the citadel, for that surviving bastion of the tenators is assuredly home to a veritable horde of fiends." Abruptly, Van Melsen jumped to his feet, spilling tea all over the place. Oblivious to this blunder, he addressed Murphy prudently. "That's it, Jason," he began. "Gati, the citadel. That's where it happened, where Treathen opened the box." Murphy frowned, returning, "I don't follow." "The noble act," the PI continued, pacing back and forth now. "You must enter the citadel and retrieve the little black box. Doing so will restore the tenators, restore the great realm of Gati." "Wait, I don't understand," Murphy declared. "I thought you were in possession of the box." "I am," Van Melsen stated, resuming his seat, "but not here in the Dreamscape. Listen, I know this doesn't make a lot of sense, but I believe your acquisition of the box will bring us a step closer to dragging you out of this place." "How can you possibly know that?" the young man begged. "Because it speaks to me. It's in constant communication with me. Can it be trusted? I haven't a clue, but that isn't important. What is important is that you get your hands on the version of it that resides here in the Dreamscape before that man in the hat does." Murphy's eyes widened. "Who is he?" "I'm sorry, Jason," the PI said, grimacing. "I'd hoped to get you out of here before bringing him up. I don't know who he is, but if this thing in my possession speaks sincerely, then it's possible that the man in the hat is looking to trade places with you. It's very likely that he's seeking a conduit through which to manifest himself on Earth. Why? I can't answer that. But I think that now you're here in the Dreamscape, all he needs to do is locate the little black box in order to cross over, trapping you here permanently." Murphy scowled and swallowed audibly. There was a moment of silence before the 31-year-old finally plucked up the nerve to ask, "What have I got myself into here?" The investigator simply shook his head and took a sip of what remained at the bottom of his teacup. "If you gaze long enough into an abyss," Van Melsen quoted, "the abyss will gaze back into you." Murphy sighed, rubbing his greasy forehead. "My presence here is to your advantage, though," the PI continued, smiling. "With my guidance, I'm sure we can pip this character to the post. I doubt he was banking on the likes of me showing up to assist you. Dozens of people back home have a vested interest in your safe return. Some have been searching for you for years." The young man nodded, a look of optimism filling his features. "Where do we begin?" he asked. "We follow the wind," the investigator stated with confidence, climbing to his feet. And, thanking the elderly lady, Hilda, for her courteousness, Jason Murphy and Peter Van Melsen strolled out onto the quiet streets of Muppen. tasting the night air, it was immediately apparent to the young man and the investigator which direction the wind was blowing. Beyond Mappen and its golden spire, beyond the dark woods, beyond the murky hills. "You must head north, Jason," Van Melsen declared, pointing towards a great peak, at the top of which a faint arc of light illumined a solitary tree. "And I'm afraid I can't go with you." Murphy glowered, searching the investigator's gaunt face for an explanation. "The noble act," Van Melsen continued. "It must be yours, and yours alone." Understanding dawned, and the young man nodded. "Once I have it, if I make it that far, that is," Murphy began. "What then?" "You must find a means of escape. It's my firm belief, though, that the little black box will aid you in this respect." "Has it aided you in coming here?" Murphy questioned. "Precisely," the PI returned, sifting through the front pocket of his velvet blazer for a cigarette. "Listen," he said, lighting his unearthed prize. "The sun, or whatever passes for a star here, is rising over Gati. The great realm is located beyond that tree there on the hill. You must reach the citadel before darkness falls again. You can't miss it. It's the only building still standing. Go now. Don't turn back. And most importantly, keep to the light. The shade is home to the dark ones." A look of cautious curiosity washed over Murphy's face. "I might regret asking this, but," he began, "what exactly are the Dark Ones?" "Phantasms," Van Melsen declared coldly. "The festering progeny of the Old Ones. Spectres, whose sole purpose is to engender death and decay in the name of their creators." "And the Old Ones?" the man in the faded jeans breathed. "A discussion for another time, Jason." "Okay," he managed through gritted teeth. Then, with some hesitation, "I suppose I'd better be on my way." "Be vigilant, Jason," warned the investigator, eyeing him intently. Nodding, the young man turned and took off along the gravel pathway, ignorant of the rough stones under his bare feet. "I'll find you afterwards," the PI called. "Mark my words." By way of acknowledgement, Murphy waved a quivering hand, his thoughts acutely focused on the task at hand. Who the mysterious investigator truly was and what he was really after were notions the 31-year-old would have to push to the back of his mind for the time being. It was odd, though. Somehow he felt that the investigator could be trusted, that the gaunt chap had his best interests in mind, that he genuinely wanted to assist him. The being, Gertrude, had said, "Look to he who has come for you." It was clear now that Gertrude had made a reference to Peter Van Melsen. As for the other character the gaunt chap had spoken of, the elusive man in the hat, Murphy wasn't so sure. What would it mean for him to end up trapped in the dreamscape? What had he hoped he would find here? An escape from the trappings of everyday life? A mundane life that had driven him to the brink of despair? There were too many unanswered questions. Questions that, if he didn't succeed in his current task, might never be answered. The very thought of failure spurred him on, and through the murky woods he trod at speed, drawn to the solitary tree at the top of the towering hill, clearly lit now by a large orange sun. Up the hill he went, doggedly, driven forward by the notion of a way out, a return to mundanity. The young man pondered the irony as his bare feet flattened fallen leaves and blades of grass. Back home, mundanity had been his undoing. Here in the dreamscape, facing the very real possibility of becoming a prisoner with no chance of parole, mundanity was a cause worth fighting for. Cresting the tree line, he pushed harder, the tree above the focus of his efforts. Fatigue was upon him. It was as though he'd been climbing the hillside for hours. And the environment was changing. Where before he trod upon soft, yielding grass, the ground beneath his bare feet was now cracked and dry. The smattering of trees he passed were crooked and bare, and although above the sun still shined, a veil of dense mist shielded the majority of its light, reducing visibility dramatically. The blackened turf beneath his feet was akin to sodden charcoal. Every step he took unearthed wiry roots and festering insects. But Murphy ploughed ever onward, in pursuit of the solitary tree. When at last he reached the top of the hill, the young man collapsed beneath the tree. It was the ghost of a tree, really. Skeletal limbs riddled with moss, a trunk hollowed by lightning. But it was a goal attained, as far as Murphy was concerned, an opportunity to rest. And there he sat, supported by the gnarled trunk, breathing rapidly. He looked out across the valley from which he'd climbed, saw the golden spire and the huddle of houses, the broad forest surrounding Muppen, all bright and verdant. Quite the contrast to his present surroundings. The hilltop the young man had attained was perfectly flat, a considerable stretch of boggy soil. Looking northward, as indicated by the subtle breeze, Murphy beheld a significant, pale glow, the source of which lay beyond the swampy plain. A drop of rain touched his cheek, then another, and another. Within a matter of seconds, the dark clouds that had gathered above positively burst, unleashing a downpour of biblical proportions. Murphy climbed into the hollow of the tree, seeking the partial shelter it offered. Protected by the withered skeleton, the young man watched as the boggy plain transformed under the influence of the heavy downpour. It was tar-like now, a black, feculent pool, flat and animated by the rain. And just as quickly as it started, the rain stopped, leaving in its wake a smooth, black surface, resembling a newly tarmacked stretch of road. Murphy emerged from the relative safety of the hollow tree, and, with a twig snapped from the trunk, tested the integrity of the new surface. The swampland was now indeed a solid surface, a road to Gati. This as evidenced by the view to the north, the source of that pale glow now revealed with the passing of the dark clouds. The man in the black t-shirt crossed the swath of asphalt at speed, seeking the edge of the hill, a position from which to behold the once great realm of Gati. Reaching the desired spot, the orange sun exposed an uncannily familiar scene. Murphy recalled an image. The painting he'd laid his eyes on in the theatre, the picture on the stage, labelled Manifestation. At first, the painting had depicted the simple landscape into which he'd recently plunged, but then he'd watched as it changed before his eyes, becoming a sprawling cityscape, withered and dead. And that was the scene before him now. Figures that might have been men impaled on pillars of scrap metal, shapes that might have been buildings rising from piles of accumulated debris, black towers looming in the background like lifeless sentinels above shadowy decay. And at the center of the nightmarish scene stood the mighty citadel, an immense tower, its dark, lofty facade calling to the young man, just as it had on the stage of the theatre. Once more, the young man felt that he needed to be there, standing at the foot of that unlikely structure. And now he knew why he needed to be there. In an abstract kind of way, the young man was beginning to make sense of his situation. Past events had foreshadowed present events, influencing his journey through the dreamscape. Onwards and upwards, the young man muttered, continuing towards the realm of decay below. The asphalt road made for a smooth descent into Gati. With every step, the ominous realm seemed to close in about him, enveloping his being. On reaching Gati proper, the horror of the scene was initially lost on the young man. His eyes didn't want to see. His mind refused to acknowledge the scale of the devastation. Hundreds of bodies littered the blackened highways, forms little more than insipid mannequins, limp depictions of terror, madness, and death. Resisting the urge to vomit, Murphy closed his eyes, inching along the derelict street in a blind stupor. But he couldn't maintain a state of sightlessness indefinitely, and so, giving in to a terrible temptation, he glanced about him like a manic fly, drawn to and yet repelled by the wreckage surrounding him. As he went, the man in the black t-shirt couldn't shake the notion that the great realm of Gati was the city of New Babylon in an aged state. Back there he'd seen bodies cluttering the streets, walked amongst them, frozen in time. But it wasn't the same place. It couldn't be. Could it? Better not to think about it, he mumbled, mindful of the debris beneath his feet. Sharp stones, metal fragments, and broken glass. It was a miracle he'd made it this far without so much as a scratch. The orange sun above did a poor job of lighting the way, but it afforded Murphy just enough illumination to navigate the desolate streets in the direction of the citadel. A grey, low-lying mist dominated the highways. It made for a humid atmosphere that was mildly suffocating. Fearful of airborne viruses, he tore a strip of fabric from his sleeve and wrapped it around his nose and mouth. The post-apocalyptic vision was complete, a masked stranger amid streets of devastation, in pursuit of something weird yet assuredly wonderful. Nearing the citadel, that great black tower at the center of the carnage, the young man found himself approaching a narrow passageway, a sinister alley between two crumbling walls. The route was dark, but, unfortunately for the seeker of the box, it was the only means of accessing that which he sought. Clutching the mask about his face, he stepped into the passage. The young man immediately realized the error of his ways. The alley was far too dark for a loner. He was vulnerable in there, visible to those rumored to occupy the shadows. In fear, he ambled forth like a drunk, stumbling into unseen objects, negotiating invisible hazards. Suddenly, something gripped his shoulder, something cold and moist, not quite a hand, a claw, perhaps. Icy breath assaulted the nape of his neck, producing gooseflesh. Murphy shut his eyes, redirecting his thoughts, searching for pleasant reveries and enticing fantasies. But the withered claw tightened its grip. Brittle fingernails sank into flesh. A bead of sweat appeared on the young man's forehead, a prelude to panic. His dainty thoughts were too meager to detract from the reality of his situation, and the noxious claw, its owner sensing Murphy's ailing resolve, tightened its grip further still. And then it spoke. "Feast upon you," came the hoarse tones of the unseen monster. "Feast upon your face." Murphy remained frozen in place, listening to the words of the creature to which he would shortly belong if he failed to act. "Turn you around," continued the monstrous voice. "Bite off your face." Refusing to yield to the Dark One, the man in the faded jeans tore himself away from the grip of the claw and dashed forward like a man possessed, unmindful of the obstacles strewn about in the shade. Seeing the light ahead, Murphy threw his quivering body headlong onto the highway beyond, basking in the dim light provided by the now waning sun. Shaking, with the inherent numbness of a child, the young man took a moment to collect himself and turned to survey the ghastly passage. Whatever had held him in its thrall had either vanished or was simply invisible in the darkness. Taking no chances, Murphy tightened his improvised mask and delved deeper into the remains of Gati. Before long, Murphy found himself striding along a wide road, at the end of which stood the great citadel. The orange sun to his rear dedicated all of its diminishing energy to lighting the vast structure. And what a structure it was! It was all but impossible to see the apex, obscured as it was by a group of gathering clouds. Nearing the tower, the young man saw that it hadn't a single window. It was composed of large black stones, lacking adornment of any kind, a titanic, imposing edifice, at the base of which a small, Gothic archway housed its only entrance. The man in the black t-shirt approached the archway and studied the portals therein. A thick layer of chalky ash cloaked the surface of the old doors, but he paid the dust no mind as he grabbed the weathered handles and shoved the heavy doors open. A dark hole met Murphy's gaze, in which several tall candle holders housed burning church candles. The holders were arranged in such a way as to suggest a route by which to navigate the space. Ahead of him, the young man caught a glimpse of an undefined figure moving off into further gloom, beyond the glare of the dozen or so flames. He called after the shape, his voice reverberating infinitely throughout the giant hall, but the call went without reciprocation. Whatever was lurking out there would continue to lurk for the nonce. Weary of the draining atmosphere of Gati's ravaged streets, Murphy stepped into the unsettling hush of the hall proper, eager to pursue his goal. The young man removed his mask and crept forward, following the meandering path as marked by the candle holders. To his rear, he heard the double doors closing, either by their own volition or aided by the hands of something gloomy and unseen. Then whispers sounded from the pockets of darkness surrounding him, weird, sibilant murmurs lacking clarity. Undeterred, Murphy continued forward, ignoring the troubling sounds. The scene was quite surreal, a barefooted man, guided by flickering candles across a hall of indeterminate scale, hounded by the mutterings of hidden critters confined to the shade. The seeker of the box pressed forth, intently focused on the path ahead of him, before reaching an obstacle to overcome, a dead end marked by a small lamp. The dead end was, in fact, a great wall of vines, a surface riddled with accessible roots to which Murphy could grip and conceivably climb. But, looking up, the young man saw nothing but darkness. The glare of the candlelight was very minimal indeed. Collecting the lamp at his feet, Murphy noted its unusual properties. It was about the size of an aluminium can, feather-light, and fitted with what appeared to be buckle loops at either end. Withdrawing the mask from his pocket, he used the material to tie the lamp to his head, and was thus armed with a hands-free source of light. He gripped the vines tentatively, testing their rigor. The roots were firm. Tightening the lamp about his head, Murphy began his ascent. Slowly he climbed, but soon enough he was high above the giant hall, looking down at the meandering path below as marked by the candle holders. The incessant whispering that had troubled him pervaded the entirety of the space now, those incomprehensible voices seemingly ascending with him. Up he went, root by root, mindful of the lamp affixed to his head, careful to pause periodically to check its integrity. But the voices were closing in, and he became aware of presences in the darkness behind him, hundreds of unblinking eyes in the void, seeking him. In the periphery of his vision, Murphy saw terrifying shapes, ghostly silhouettes with claws for hands, dark ones, reminiscent of the thing that had accosted him in the murky alley. The proximity of these shadowy creatures served only to boost the young man's stamina, their translucent talons penetrating the circle of light surrounding him, his only protection from their deadly clutches. With every ounce of strength remaining him, he clung to the roots, driving himself ever upward towards salvation. Dark limb after dark limb sought Murphy's being, the cacophonous whispering intensified by a growing frustration, as the owners of those pitch-black appendages repeatedly failed to reach him. The seeker of the box was an automaton, relentless in his determination to elude the Dark Ones, sweat pouring from his brow. But this latter outcome of his efforts was working against him. The perspiration was loosening the grip of the headlamp. Frequently, he stopped to wipe the sweat away, hounded by innumerable claws, as he retightened the lamp. And there it was, just above him, an opening in the great wall of vines, a lighted corridor into which he dragged himself like a tiger in its death throes. A strident screeching ensued, issued by the defeated Dark Ones, incapable of following Murphy into the light. The man in the black t-shirt rolled onto his back, his heart galloping in his chest. He lay there in an apathetic daze, utterly wiped out by the horrifying ascent. Finally, having recovered somewhat, the young man climbed to his feet and approached the edge of the opening. Peering out into the gloom, he was no longer able to perceive the candlelit path below. How high had he climbed to reach his present location? He no longer sensed the Dark Ones, nor could he hear their ceaseless murmuring. The only sound that remained was the beating of his settling heart, interspersed with his quick breathing. Removing the lamp from his head, he tied it to his forearm and turned to survey the stone corridor in which he was standing. As had been the case below, a number of candle holders lined the passageway, host of flickering candles. The stone walls were entirely bare, guiding the eye of the observer towards another opening at the opposite end. Sensing the nearness of something mysterious and powerful, quite possibly the very thing he sought, Murphy crossed the corridor and discovered the entrance to a curious chamber. Was it an ancient bathhouse into which he strolled? The chamber was impressive in every sense of the word. A floor tiled in marble lay beneath his feet, enclosed by oddly frescoed pillars, with a still, dark pool at the center, surmounted by a domed, mosaiced ceiling. The chamber held a note of the grandiose, suggested by the nature of the frescoes, peculiar women in regal garb, their pompous heads held high. But it was the opalescent pool that called to the man in the black t-shirt, something that he sensed awaited him in its watery belly. Creeping along the cold tiles, Murphy's eyes remained fixed on the small pool. How still the water was, its mirror-like surface exhibiting a perfect reflection of the domed ceiling. So perfect was the image that the young man was unable to detect anything whatsoever beneath the surface. He approached the water's edge and got down onto his hands and knees, studying his reflection. A grubby face looked back at him, a mask of soot below a mound of unkempt hair. His journey thus far hadn't afforded him the opportunity to bathe. Perhaps the pool before him would allow him to do just that. The 31-year-old removed his clothes. Tentatively, he slipped into the water and was surprised to discover that it was warm, a bathhouse indeed. He wiped the soot from his face and rinsed his hair, losing himself for a moment in the calm of the pool. But Murphy wasn't alone in the opal waters. A vision returned to him, that of the experience he'd had during the tilting of the water body after leaving New Babylon. Out on the waters, he'd been unaccountably whisked away from that cascade scenario, finding himself on a raft, floating on tranquil seas. Beneath him, though, had lurked a frightful figure, a pale lady that had gripped the raft and pulled herself up before the vision promptly ceased. Had the vision been a glimpse of things to come? For now, there in the opalescent pool, Murphy beheld the onset of bubbles, immediately followed by thick strands of golden hair covered in tiny barnacles. The young man was frozen in place, could only watch as the face of the fearsome woman arose. But it wasn't the face of a monster the young man beheld. It was a beautiful face, extraordinarily so. The being's skin was damp and grey, but supple. Her eyes were wide and staring, but iridescent like soap bubbles. The curve of her jaw was exquisite, and her full, round lips were mesmerizing.
"You needn't be afraid of me, Jason,"
came the lady's voice, a low, sensual voice that penetrated the young man's gut.
"Look, I have that which you seek."
Murphy simply stared as the figure's bony arms emerged from the waters, her skeletal hands clutching the sought-after object, the little black box.
"He who came before you,"
she continued,
"is a hostile individual, incapable of performing the necessary act."
The noble act? The young man managed, his attention torn between the oddly compelling face of the mysterious lady and the object held out before her.
"Yes,"
she said.
"It is you who shall relieve Gati of its blight. It has always been you, and it is you who shall prevent the hostile one from crossing over. These are the reasons you were called here, Jason."
Mesmerized by the Lady of the Pool's words, Murphy nodded, finding himself floating towards her. "Who are you?" the young man ventured.
"I'm many things. The swinging pendulum, representative of good, evil, and the shades of grey between. I spoke to you in dreams. The box made it possible."
Murphy realized the significance of her words as the lady with the perfect lips recited that strange verse he'd come to know as the Path.
"It's a dusty old thing, that memory, littered with weeds unseen. Over the hills, under the trees, there on the edge of a dream. Stray too far and you'll miss it. The thought it won't ever occur. To stray into wilds without reason, magnificent, the end of despair. Beyond the bridges of slumber, no Cuth and her barnacled throne. Fade into blackness and stroll by the light, close to the end of the line. And when awake once again by the starlight, look to the eye of the storm, but beware the path less travelled, for you might just forget who you are."
"It's you," Murphy murmured. "No Cuth." The barnacled being nodded, proffering the little black box to the young man now floating before her.
"Take it, Jason, and go forth,"
she whispered, smiling reassuringly. And Murphy did just that. The seeker of the box hadn't given much thought to what might happen should he actually acquire it. Perhaps he believed he'd be forced to descend that awful wall of vines and brave the terrible streets of Gati once more. But he certainly hadn't expected the thing that occurred the moment he touched the strange object. The pool and his immediate surroundings instantaneously transformed. No longer was he face to face with the barnacled lady, but instead Murphy found himself sitting in what appeared to be a storage space. Surrounding him were countless imperceptible shapes, presumably items of furniture concealed beneath dark sheets. The only light source was the lamp he'd found, sitting on top of his clothes beside him. Quickly dressing, he untied the material from the lamp and wrapped the little black box in it. Clutching the lamp, he took off across the cluttered room in search of a way out. Locating a dreary corridor, Murphy paused at the threshold. At the opposite end, silhouetted by a soft luminescence, stood a familiar figure, the man in the hat. "Hello? Hello?" the young man called. No response was forthcoming. "What do you want?" Murphy ventured. Still, no reply was elicited. But the keeper of the box sensed the stranger's intentions. Having been denied the mysterious object, the man in Murphy's midst was going to try to take it from him. Murphy took a tentative step backwards. The stranger took a step forward in kind, and that was all it required to provoke a reaction. The keeper of the box spun on his heel and took off running. Through the room of shapes he fled, ducking and diving at every turn, desperately seeking another way out. He heard the oncoming footfalls of the man in the hat, the distinctive tread of heavy boots on stone, closing in at speed. Propelled by the item in his possession, Murphy sprinted with every ounce of his being and stumbled into another corridor, a passage uncannily similar to the one through which he had accessed the bathhouse. On he ran, noting the candle holders lining its bare walls. This was the corridor that had led to the bathhouse, which could mean only one thing. At the opposite end was a sudden drop-off, a plunge into the infested shadows of that giant hall below. A thunderous crash sounded to Murphy's rear as something toppled in the storage room. Splintering wood was heard as something else went the same way. Then the very walls about him began to shake, accompanied by a low rumble, suggestive of an earthquake. The young man continued to run until he saw the opening ahead of him, that yawning gulf from which he'd narrowly managed to escape with his life, and he was being pursued in its direction by the man in the hat, the citadel itself coming apart at the seams. The man in the black t-shirt was left with a simple choice, to jump or not to jump. Time slowed to a crawl as he neared that precipitous edge. The persistent footfalls of the man in the hat resembled the slow, rhythmic pounding of a failing heart, and the quake rocking the citadel he sensed in the back of his throat, like a preface to throwing up. But Murphy's pace was that of a galloping horse. His great momentum left him with no choice whatsoever. Clutching the lamp in one hand and the bundled box in the other, he closed his eyes, let out an almighty scream, and leapt into absolute darkness. Part 4. The White Room. "What?" Murphy muttered, scanning his surroundings. The man who had leapt into the darkness was lying in a crumpled heap in the middle of what appeared to be a cluttered living room. Light streamed into the room from a large, oval window, revealing a variety of objects. An old mahogany dresser host to a chess rook and a squirrel clutching a crystal ball, a display cabinet filled to the brim with dusty books, a coffee table littered with magazines and faded photographs, and a great fireplace housing a healthy fire.
"Cup of tea, young man?"
came a voice from across the room. It was the familiar voice of Hilda, the elderly lady who had provided him and Van Melsen with refreshments earlier that same day, if it was, in fact, the same day. Murphy mumbled, stumbling to his feet. "Please." The young man had managed a couple of steps in no particular direction, when it occurred to him that he was no longer in possession of the little black box. The curious lamp was missing too. Only the strip of material torn from his t-shirt remained, tucked into the pocket of his faded jeans. "Through here, Jason," came another familiar voice. This one belonged to the gaunt chap in the overcoat, Peter Van Melsen. Murphy made his way across the carpeted room and entered the dining room. "What happened?" the young man asked, seating himself opposite the man tasked with his safe return home. "I had it, Peter. Had it right here," he added, dangling the strip of material in front of Van Melsen's face. "Of course you did," Van Melsen stated. "You wouldn't be here otherwise."
"Here we go,"
said Hilda, placing piping hot cups of pine-needle tea in front of the pair at the table. Then, ogling Murphy,
"You especially, young man, should drink all of that down."
Nodding and suddenly very aware of his thirst, Murphy sipped at the tea enthusiastically. "Thanks," he said, as Hilda shuffled away. "How do you feel?" Van Melsen asked, studying the dark rings around the young man's eyes. "Exhausted," he breathed, holding the cup close to his chest. I can only imagine, the investigator responded, but I have it on good authority that your efforts yielded the desired result. Murphy looked up at the gaunt man, a look of hope filling his face. Gertie has been restored? He asked. That it has, Van Melsen replied, grinning like a madman. The great realm is as it once was, rather like the tenators never encountered the strange machine. What happened to the box? Where is it? Gone from this place. Didn't you say you had it? Not any more, Van Melsen said, gesturing towards the cluttered room. The moment you appeared in that room, I ceased to sense it. But I still don't understand, Murphy blurted. Why did these so-called old ones call for the destruction of Gertie in the first place? And how were my actions able to restore it? Some things go above and beyond the matters of why and how, Jason. Destructive forces, the old ones included, are abundant. Should we question the morality of a volcanic eruption? Repudiate the power of the sun? These things, by their very nature, are incapable of ethical reasoning. Your seizure of the box was a moral act. The strange machine recognized it as such and reversed the destruction it had caused. And that's it? Murphy pleaded, frowning. As far as the little black box is concerned, yes, Van Melsen said, nodding. As for you and me, he continued, we're actors in a play. Ahead of us is the fifth and final act, or, more appropriately, the fourth and final step. For several moments, the pair sipped pine-needle tea in quiet contemplation. Where do we go from here? The young man asked. There's another structure, the PI stated. Far from here, a desert plain houses a vast tower, much taller than the citadel. I caught a glimpse of it prior to your return to Muppen. It was the last thing the box revealed to me. I'm certain we'll find what we're looking for there. We must find it. How? Murphy begged, the notion of further adventure increasing his lethargy. Haven't you worked that out by now? Follow the wind, the young man said, with just the slightest hint of cynicism. Van Melsen nodded, displaying that toothy grin again. But we must move, Jason. He's coming. The man in the hat? Yes. Without the box, you're his only option. He knows you want out of this place, knows his only chance of escape is to overtake you at the finish line, as it were. If your actions result in the opening of a door, all he needs to do is step through it before you. The young man sighed. I'm not sure I can make it, Peter, he said. I'm done. Of course you can, Van Melsen stated affirmatively. And besides, you won't be heading out there alone this time. No? Absolutely not, came the decisive tones of the investigator. I'll be right there with you, all the way. Murphy managed a smile and nodded. Now get some rest, Van Melsen continued. You'll need to be refreshed for the journey ahead of us. Again, the man in the black t-shirt nodded, climbing to his feet.
This way, dearie,
instructed Hilda, who had emerged from the depths of the house to escort Murphy to the guest room. The exhausted 31-year-old crawled onto the comfortable bed that awaited him in the quaint guest room and lay back. He denied the swarm of thoughts that threatened to invade his mind and fell asleep the second his head hit the feather pillow. When Murphy awoke, he found the gaunt character Peter Van Melsen towering over him. Time to be moving on, the investigator said, handing Murphy a pair of plimsolls. I reckon these should fit, he added, glancing at the young man's dusty feet. Belong to Hilda's late husband. Thanks, Murphy uttered with a grimace. Slipping the plain plimsolls on, the young man crossed the room and splashed his face with water from a pail at the end of the bed. Thereafter, he and Van Melsen left the small house, thanking the elderly lady once more for her hospitality.
May the wind be at your back, Hilda
offered, as the steadfast men stepped out into the twilight. Mappen was bustling. Villagers went about their business on the quiet streets, carrying large sacks of grain and firewood back and forth between dwellings. A crimson sky enclosed the scene, the last vestiges of the fleeting orange sun. Gauging the direction of the wind, Van Melsen led them south, out of Mappen and the Vale, and back onto the open plains into which the pair had plunged some time ago. The landscape was different under the violet light. The surrounding hills were reduced to dark, looming forms, the plain itself little more than a sprawling expanse, a vast swath across which the gentle wind encouraged them. Soon enough, darkness was absolute. The unlikely pair yielded to the breeze, a comforting gale that offered a sense of purpose. And then, quite abruptly, Van Melsen whispered, "He's here." "What?" Murphy blurted. "Him?" The investigator nodded, urging them onwards. The young man studied his immediate surroundings, saw nothing. But when he turned his head and looked north, back along the expanse, he thought he detected the faintest of outlines in the deep distance, the suggestion of a figure, a dark figure in a trilby hat. "Let your eyes look directly forward," Van Melsen quoted, "and your gaze be straight before you." And as the investigator spoke, a small black dot appeared in front of them. The dot floated just ahead of them, matching their pace. "See it, Jason?" "Yes," Murphy said, drawn to the spot. "We must walk a little faster," Van Melsen instructed, increasing his pace. The man in the plain plimsolls matched it. "Faster still," came the instructions of the PI, and once more upped his pace. And Murphy matched it, again and again, until the pair of them were jogging towards the little black dot ahead of them. As the pair accelerated, the spot began to expand, growing rapidly, until it was about the size of a manhole cover. And then the floating circle became a square, and the scene surrounding them, the dark skies and darker grass, the suggestion of hills astride the plain, was pulled towards it, like water swirling down a drain. "Run, Jason!" Van Melsen called, observing the instability of the ground beneath his feet. The pair went like the clappers in pursuit of the dark mass ahead of them, as it sought to draw the very landscape around them into its heart like dust into a vacuum. The world they occupied was collapsing exponentially, compelled as it was by the singularity. Murphy knew what the PI was about to yell before the words left his mouth. "Jump, Jason!" Van Melsen shouted, and without hesitation, the young man leapt towards the dark square. The investigator followed in quick succession, and a nanosecond later, the pair were gliding through mid-air prior to landing with considerable force on a polished wooden floor. The intrepid pair were surprised to find themselves back in New Babylon, prone, on the stage of the theatre. But it wasn't as it had been before. The main hall and parterre were crammed, filled to the brim with spectators. The gods were packed, too, clean-shaven and made-up faces staring down at them. The expectant crowd watched closely as the pair climbed to their feet, studying their surroundings. Turning, Murphy was the first to notice the painting on the easel. It was manifestation, and once again it was alive with motion. Within its depths was a figure, the man in the hat, traversing a shadowy plain, barely visible under starry skies. Van Melsen dashed towards the painting and put his fist through it. Murphy was immediately at his side, tearing at the canvas, squashing the fragments in his hands. This display of violence seemed to provoke a reaction from the audience. A solitary voice shouted, followed by a number of claps and whistles. In a matter of seconds, the entire audience was upright, engaged in the act of applauding and cheering. It was a standing ovation the pair were receiving, a celebration of their demolition. Automatically, driven to it by the overwhelming sense of elation in the air, the pair bowed to the adoring crowd, then took off backstage in quest of the door labelled Exit. But it was a new Babylon into which Murphy and Van Melsen plunged on leaving the theatre. Bright sunlight stole their vision as they descended the small flight of stairs at the back of the building. The steps delivered them to a massive expanse of sand, across which only rippling dunes met their gaze. The vivid yellow sun hovered directly above them, a scorching spotlight from which there appeared to be no shelter. The pair would have sought refuge in the theatre, but turning to survey the building they just left, their eyes met only a further extension of the barren sandscape. The theatre was gone, as was any evidence that it had ever stood there in the desert. But on the horizon, much closer than the unlikely duo might have dared hope, stood a strange structure, a perfectly vertical mast, or pylon, disappearing into the haze of the upper atmosphere. The sheer scale of the thing was unprecedented. Neither of the two men in its midst had ever gazed upon such a construction. It was undoubtedly that which they sought. Van Melsen was certain of the fact, owing to that fleeting glimpse provided by the box prior to its mysterious departure. The pylon stood alone on the horizon, its only company the wandering dunes at its base. And then another curious thing occurred. The yellow sun above began to descend. It moved swiftly across the sky, crested the strange mast, then dipped out of view behind it. In doing so, a shadow was cast towards the awed pair, a shadow that would serve as both protection from the scorching orb and a dark path towards the pylon. "Let's go," Van Melsen said simply, and took off along the new highway. Murphy walked at his side, his hand-me-down footwear providing protection from the red-hot sand. "I'm not sure about this place," the investigator said, as they crossed the difficult terrain. "The desert?" the young man asked. "The Dreamscape. New Babylon, Garty, everything in between. There's something familiar about this place, and I'm not talking about dreams." "What could it mean?" "I can't say," Van Melsen muttered, "but I sense I've known this place. It's in the air, the sun. If only I could put my finger on it." Murphy had little to say in response to that. His impression of the world into which he'd wandered was quite different. He thought of what the large dwarf, Red, had told him in the woods. The Dreamscape is a transitional realm, a world between worlds. What could it mean for Van Melsen to have known it? But the young man chose to keep his mouth shut, as the investigator withdrew what appeared to be the last cigarette from the pocket of his blazer. "Ah, well," Van Melsen breathed, lighting it. "Be home soon." As the pair neared the mast, they noted it was of metal construction, smooth, dark, but non-reflective, some 50 feet or so in diameter. Patterns were hewn into its surface, intricate etchings that, as seen from a distance, appeared to be random. On closer inspection, however, Murphy perceived the markings as extensive Cretan labyrinths, whereas Van Melsen saw them as the outlines of human brains. The duo located the entrance to the pylon, partially hidden though it was by the roaming sand. The door lacked embellishment of any kind, just a plain metal portal, offering little indication of what might lie beyond. Van Melsen wasted no time in brushing the sand away, and, with the assistance of the young man at his side, took hold of the metal door handle and pushed it open. A narrow rotunda lay before them, host to a winding staircase. Mounds of dust peppered the stark concrete floor. A dozen white lights shone back at them from the smooth, round walls. Stepping inside, the PI motioned towards the stairs. "I guess the only way is up," he said, wryly. Then, turning to the man in the black t-shirt, "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Murphy muttered, looking up into the central shaft. A black void looked back at him. "It's dark up there," he added, looking to his colleague for reassurance. "Well, I have my pocket lighter," Van Melsen said, withdrawing the golden object from an inside pocket. "We'll use it sparingly. Hang on to the rail as we go." The young man nodded, willing to accept anything the investigator had to say at this point. "Quietly now," the PI added. "Mustn't draw attention to ourselves." "You think he's still on our trail?" Murphy put in. "Undoubtedly." Up the pair went, their right hands clinging to the wooden rail. Footfall followed footfall as they climbed into blackness, the dedicated pair willing themselves onwards and upwards toward some unknowable destination. After a solid 30 minutes or so of relentless ascent, Van Melsen insisted the two take a break, and out came the pocket lighter. Tired and somewhat dazed due to the spiraling ascent, the duo lay back on the steps, resisting the temptation to vomit. Murphy, panting, struggled to come to terms with the sheer scale of the mast. "You saw it, Peter. How will we ever reach the top?" "Oh, ye of little faith," the PI returned. "And anyway, who said we're meant to reach the top?" The thought hadn't occurred to the young man. "We climb until we find what we're looking for," Van Melsen continued. "The fourth step awaits us here. Of that, I am sure." Murphy pondered the notion. "I feel like I know what the fourth step is," he said, turning to look at the gaunt face beside him, animated by the flickering flame of the lighter. "It's on the tip of my tongue." "I wish I could help draw it out of you," the investigator said, smiling emptily. "Let's get going," the man in the black T-shirt asserted. Van Melsen flicked the lighter closed, and the pair took off climbing again. They hadn't been on their feet long when the investigator stopped them in their tracks and withdrew the lighter once again. "What is it?" Murphy whispered. The PI put a finger to his lips, then mouthed, "Listen." From far below, deep in the darkness, the sound of footsteps soared to meet their ears. The distinctive tread of heavy boots reverberated throughout the mast, the source of the sounds close at hand. "It's him," Van Melsen stated matter-of-factly. "Come on." The weary duo climbed with a renewed sense of urgency, step by step, utilizing every ounce of strength to lift them ever higher, stretching the sinews of endurance to breaking point. And it was in the midst of this final push that Van Melsen noticed a dim source of light above them, a soft glow that promised an end to their drudgery. A few more arduous steps, and the handrail to which they clung became visible. They saw again the stairway beneath their feet, and the cold metal walls of the rotunda. "Almost there," the investigator managed, puffing and wheezing, cursing his smoking habit. The source of the soft glow was a narrow passage, a lengthy corridor that, given the limited width of the pylon, shouldn't have existed. A lantern attached to a carrying stick was propped up by the entrance to the passage, an item Van Melsen was quick to collect, throwing it over his shoulder like a hobo's bindle. Into the corridor the PI went, and Murphy followed, his eyes drawn to the red brick walls enclosing them. The unlikely pair tramped along the passage for what seemed like hours, the walls around them unchanging, the darkness towards which they blundered ceaselessly beckoning. And when finally they reached the end of the tunnel, it was an inconspicuous wooden gate that awaited them, a gate exceedingly familiar to the man in the black T-shirt. "How can this be?" Murphy mumbled, bewilderment drenching his words. The gate was small and relatively simple in design, faded, scratched, and part painted a deep blood red. Affixed to a horizontal slat at the top of the gate was the Roman numeral X in brass. "I'm home again," Murphy muttered. "10B Fall Lane. This is the back gate." Van Melsen had surmised as much the moment he'd noticed the number in brass, but the purpose of the weird diversion eluded him. The lantern over his shoulder flickered, as Murphy moved closer to the gate, tracing the familiar marks and indentations the young man recognized from childhood. With trembling fingers, he pushed the gate tentatively, and slowly it creaked open. "Remember, Jason," Van Melsen warned, as a new source of light streamed into the corridor. "This isn't your home. You're in the dreamscape. Home is far, far away from here." Nodding, the man in the black t-shirt edged forward, stepping into the light. The space the pair now occupied was a large, empty room, white walls and white ceiling. No windows were visible, nor were there any doors. Even the source of light was impossible to detect. No spotlights, no candles, just a plain, white room, perfectly square. The young man and the investigator strolled into the heart of the room, some 20 paces or so, scanning its featureless walls for a means of egress. It was as though the room was formed of a single piece of exotic material, folded in such a way as to form a seamless cube. "What is this place, Peter?" the young man asked, sniffing the air like a dog. Van Melsen shook his head, perplexed. "I haven't—" "Peter!" Murphy interjected, turning on his heel. The PI whirled round, his eyes drawn to the source of Murphy's consternation. By the wall, where before the little red gate had been, stood the unflinching man in the hat. His general appearance was clearly visible now, lit as he was by the unfathomable light source. He was tall and thin, sporting black trousers and a long overcoat. Black gloves covered his hands, black leather boots clung to his feet, but his face, shaded by the brim of his dark trilby, remained a mystery. "Who are you?" Murphy cried, his heart racing in his chest. "Show yourself!" But the man remained inert, motionless, a spectator awaiting some action on the part of his present company. "What do you want?" the young man continued, pummeling the quiet figure for information. Van Melsen, on the other hand, remained completely silent in the stranger's presence. Somehow, he was intercepting the man in the hat's thoughts, obtaining information utterly mind-blowing to the investigator. How he was intercepting it, Van Melsen hadn't the foggiest, but that was hardly important, given the nature of the data he was receiving. But then, quite suddenly, Murphy took a daring step forward. "Step 4!" he yelled, elated. "Face your fear. Face it. Overcome it. Embrace it." And the young man took another step forward, a small step this one, then another, a bigger one, another, closing the distance between himself and the quiet figure in his midst. The stranger fought to conquer the will of the approaching man, covered his face with his gloved hands, shook his head in defiance. But the conviction of Jason Murphy was too much for the man in the hat. He recoiled and took several steps backwards, until he was flat against the white wall, wriggling and squirming. Van Melsen watched in speechless awe as the man in the black t-shirt, who before was so unsure of himself, so bewildered and helpless, now pounded the shadowy stranger with burst after burst of intense resilience, the likes of which the investigator had never encountered before. "It's over," Murphy yelled, chock full of stony resolve now. "It's time for you to leave." And with those definitive words, the man in the hat turned and hurled himself at the white wall. The wall collapsed under the weight of the figure's body, and into a pit of darkness the man in the hat fell, leaving a rectangular frame in his wake, resembling a door. Murphy breathed deeply, took a moment to reorientate himself. Approaching the dark portal, he muttered, "The path is complete." Van Melsen was instantly at his side, his eyes drawn to the void beyond the rectangular frame. "You did it," the investigator congratulated, patting the young man on the back. "It all came back to me, Peter. The moment I laid my eyes on him, I knew what I had to do. Step 4, face your fear. Face it, overcome it, embrace it. And the path is complete, Van Melsen finished. Murphy nodded, an air of wonder about him. Motioning to the rectangular frame, the investigator said, "This door, I believe, is your salvation, Jason." "What do you think happened to him?" Murphy ventured, nodding at the void. "You repelled him. Is he dead, do you think?" Van Melsen shrugged. "I hope so," he said. To this, Murphy frowned, repeating, "You hope so?" "I'll explain on the other side. Come on, let's get the hell out of here." And with that, the unlikely duo crossed the curious threshold before them, and returned to a more tangible world, a saner world. Epilogue. The shopkeeper, Gary Cook, watched with wide, unblinking eyes as the veil of vapor surrounding him in his imitation hookah lounge began to dissipate, revealing not one, but two individuals, sitting quietly on the array of cushions opposite him. Removing his mask, Cook was eager to address the pair. "Peter?" "Gary," the PI replied, nodding casually. "You haven't got a cigarette, have you?" "Of course," Cook announced, producing a pack of 20 from the breast pocket of his shirt. Lighting one, he proceeded to pass it to his old friend, a look of impatience staining his face. Inhaling deeply, Van Melsen motioned to the young man sitting next to him. "Gary, meet Jason Murphy." Murphy, still reeling from his weird adventure, nodded in Cook's direction. "Jason," Cook said, bowing his head in acknowledgement. "How long was I out there?" the investigator quizzed. 2, 3 hours, something like that. I haven't budged an inch." Then, as an afterthought, "Bladder like a camel." Van Melsen winced. 2 or 3 hours? I was out there for days, Gary. Perception is a hell of a thing, old friend. What about him? He's been missing for over a decade." In response to which, Murphy returned a wry smile. It'd be a long time before he could wrap his head around the concept of his prolonged absence. In the hours that followed, Van Melsen, with sizable contributions from the young man, outlined the events that had transpired in the Dreamscape, Murphy's experiences in the city of New Babylon, his encounter with the dwarf Red and the entity known as Gertrude, the terrifying matter of the noble act in the great realm of Gati, and the final confrontation with the mysterious stranger in the White Room. Murphy's journey was an act of displacement, Van Melsen said. The 4 steps, in conjunction with the little black box, granted Murphy entrance to the Dreamscape, but also a way back from it. The voice in his dreams, the words that lured him to that strange place, belonged to the barnacled lady, the great Nokuth. She saw it all, Gary. Cook was aghast, mumbling, "Saw what?" "Pimpernella and the little black box, the meddling of the old ones, the man in the hat." The shopkeeper frowned, impatience obscuring his wizened face. "It is he who we should concern ourselves with, Gary," Van Melsen said. "I spoke earlier with regards to my recurring dream." Then, addressing Murphy, "A dream you and I have often shared, Jason. In the dream, I'm standing at the top of a peak in a vast cavern. Below me, a strange airship hovers above a lake." "That's you up there?" the young man exclaimed. "There's more, Jason. He's there too, the man in the hat. I believe he's the source of the dream, wants us to dream it." "To what end?" Cook put in, suitably intrigued. "To make us aware of him, Gary, aware of his intentions. It wasn't Murphy reaching out to me in dreams. It was him. The barnacled lady knew it too. That was why she called upon our sensitive dreamer here. She was working to prevent it. To prevent what, Peter? Cook pressed. The coming of the man in the hat, Van Melsen stated. I intercepted his thoughts, Gary, he continued. I sensed a tremendous desire on his part to walk amongst us, to subjugate and control us. As of yet, he's weak. We can only hope that Murphy's actions in the White Room destroyed him. Nodding, Cook said, I have much to discuss with my colleagues. We need to get all this down on paper. The loose ends, the paradoxes. Indeed, Van Melsen agreed. I fear our work here has just begun. Nudging Murphy, the investigator climbed to his feet. Come on, Jason. Let's get some air. The two left the shopkeeper to his thoughts for a stretch and stepped out into the muggy air of a July evening in Scotland. I've asked this before, Murphy began, but where do we go from here? Answers will be forthcoming, my friend, Van Melsen said, searching his pockets for the cigarettes he'd exhausted in the Dreamscape. But we've much to contemplate, many stones to overturn. Murphy gazed into the clear night sky above. He looked to the moon, welcomed the stars. Almost 14 years, he muttered. Have I aged? Let's put it this way, the PI breathed, abandoning his search for the depleted cigarettes. You look pretty good for someone in his mid-40s. How am I going to explain it? That's something you'll have to work out for yourself, Jason. Murphy shrugged. I suppose so. I've definitely got some loose ends to tie up. Van Melsen nodded. It'll take some time, he said, patting Murphy on the back. The answers we seek are out there. We just need to find them. But even as he said it, the renowned paranormal investigator found himself troubled by a singular notion. And later, when jotting his experiences down in his journal, aka survival guide, he spoke of it explicitly. The stranger and I have something in common. I can't imagine what it might be, but I suspect it involves the dreamscape, the uncanny familiarity of the place. Have I roamed those weird streets and desolate plains before? I am all but certain I have, and I will again. And what of my dreams? I fear them now, for if I dream of him, I'll know that he survived that plunge into the void. A few days later, Jason Murphy found himself pulling onto Beefold Lane, West Broughton. Even prior to his uncanny disappearance, he hadn't been home for a long time. He and his mother had been at loggerheads for as long as he could remember. The death of the young man's father had transformed the relationship with his mother into something neither of them could stomach. It was a terribly sad state of affairs, but after such a long absence, he was committed to the quarrel's resolution. Murphy parked on the curb outside his childhood home and stared at the old place for the longest time before climbing from the car. Approaching the house, the young man in his mid-40s contemplated the brickwork and slate roof, admired the white wooden window frames, still so carefully maintained by his mother, gawped at the front door with the distinctive cricket ball indentation, and lastly considered the number 10 in bold striking brass above the door. Sanctuary, he whispered as he raised his hand to knock. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,